Hi, everybody. It's my really great pleasure to welcome you all to Contemporary Women's Writing and the Medical Humanities International Online Conference, organized by the Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing in association with the Institute of Modern Languages and the School of Advanced Study. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here for our keynote lecture today, which will be given by Havi Carel. My name is Elinor Cleghorn, and I am a white woman with dark reddish hair, and I'm wearing a black dress and gold pendant, gold earrings, and I'm sitting behind a lilac wall, and I'm coming to you from Sussex in the south of England. I am a writer, researcher, and the author of a new book called Unwell Women, which is this book, which was published last month by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in the UK and by Dutton Books in the US, and it's currently being translated into 6 languages. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled today to welcome you to our keynote lecture. And before we get started, and before I introduce Havi Carel, just got a little bit of housekeeping for our discussion after Havi's lecture. So Havi Carel will speak for about 45 minutes, after which there will be time for questions. You can ask your questions in the chat function or live on screen. If you'd like to ask a live question, please either use the raise hand function, if you can see it there on your Zoom, which you'll find if you click on the participants button on the end of the screen, or you can let me, the chair, know via the chat that you'd like to ask a question. If you would like to ask an anonymous question, please make sure to direct your question privately to the chair, that's Elinor Cleghorn, in the chat function. This session is being recorded and will be published on the IMLR website. So if you don't wish to appear in the recording, please do ask your question anonymously. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce Havi Carel, who'll be giving today's lecture titled Phenomenology of Illness, Vulnerabilized Bodies and Illness Testimony. Havi Carel is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol, where she also teaches medical students. She recently completed a Wellcome Trust Senior Investigator, leading a 5-year project, The Life of Breath. She was awarded the Health Humanities Inspiration Award 2018 for her work on this project. Her third monograph was published by Oxford University Press in 2016, entitled Phenomenology of Illness. Havi was voted by students as a Best of Bristol lecturer in 2016. Havi is the author of Illness, 2008, 2013, 2018, shortlisted for the Wellcome Trust Book Prize, and of Life and Death in Freud and Heidegger, 2006. She is the co-editor of Health, Illness and Disease, 2012, and of What Philosophy Is, 2004. She uses film in teaching and has co-edited a volume entitled New Takes in Film Philosophy, 2010. She also co-edited a special issue of Philosophy on Human Experience and Nature in 2013. She previously published on the embodied experience of illness, epistemic injustice, well-being within illness, and on the experience of respiratory illness in The Lancet, BMJ, Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, Journal of Medical Ethics, Journal of Applied Philosophy, Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics, Medicine, Healthcare and Philosophy, and in edited collections. In 2009 to 2011, Havi led an AHRC-funded project on concepts of health, illness, and disease. In 2011-12, she was awarded a Leverhulme Fellowship for a project entitled The Lived Experience of Illness. In 2012-13, she held a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship. So I'm sure you will all join me in warmly welcoming Havi Carel. And thank you so much, and see you after Havi's lecture.
Thank you very much, Elinor, for this grand introduction. And thank you to Ben and the other organizers and hosts, and of course to everybody who's turned up virtually. I'm in a slightly odd setting, so I'll apologize in advance. I'm at home. This is our wallpaper, and I've got 2 children off school, well, in the summer holidays. So I hope we can have a largely uninterrupted session, but I do apologize in advance if it's not the case. So I'll share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see and hear me fine. If not, just call out or let Elinor know, and I'll try and sort it out. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'll try and cover a fair amount of ground to give us, I hope, a taste of what a phenomenology of illness is like. So my discipline is philosophy, and Ben and I had a few chats to try and choose what would be the most of most interest to the people at the conference. So what I'm going to do is to present what a phenomenology of illness might look like, and then talk a little bit about why we need a phenomenology of illness. I will try and say something about questions of diversity within phenomenology, but also say quite a lot about the kind of general features of illness and how phenomenology can help us understand those. So the reason I turned my attention to work on the experience of illness is because I thought it had a very profound philosophical core. I started working on philosophy of illness and more broadly on philosophy of medicine when I became ill myself with a chronic lung condition about 15 years ago. And I found an incredibly rich and worthwhile area to work in and to mine. And what I want to do is, first of all, set out some of the questions and try and explain why I think they're philosophically interesting, or why is illness philosophically interesting. So of course we all have a pragmatic or practical interest in illness, and that could be mainly because we worry about getting ill ourselves or have gotten ill ourselves, or because somebody close to us is ill and we want to know that there are practical solutions or biomedical interventions that are appropriate. But of course, illness and other forms of vulnerability and affliction, if you like, have been at the core of philosophical debates for thousands of years. You can find ancient Greek thinkers commenting on illness as an existential challenge, or understanding our response to illness as something that we ought to be considering as philosophers. So maybe mirroring, Epicurus's famous claims that we shouldn't fear death, and that the fear of death is irrational, and that a philosophical task is to try and unpick the irrationality of the fear of death so we can free ourselves of that fear. Similarly, the engagement with illness, affliction, injury, and other forms of human suffering have always been core to the philosophical tradition. And that's primarily because these kinds of experiences, even if they're pushed to the side in a lot of philosophical mainstream work, is near universal. So the claim I want to start out with is not just that illness is near universal, but that our vulnerability to calamity, to affliction, to tragic circumstances is a near universal trait that maybe all humans share, but we also spend a lot of time trying to deny or repress at least some aspects of it. So we can all think of a response to somebody talking about their fear of death by saying, oh, what's the point of worrying about it? We're here now. So, as Epicurus famously said, where I am, death is not yet. And that's a laudable attempt to dispel our discomfort of that deeply vulnerable, that profoundly susceptible nature of our embodied existence. But of course, it's not satisfactory, primarily because illness is a near universal experience and the vulnerability is universal. None of us are exempt from that vulnerability. And I want to really try and think about vulnerability in a broader sense, thinking, of course, about illness and healthcare as paradigmatic examples, but you might also think about other ways in which people might be vulnerable. For example, through poverty and disenfranchisement, by being members of marginalized or negatively stereotyped groups, of belonging to particular social groups and being treated with prejudice, of having certain kinds of disabilities, of suffering from mental ill health, struggling with a learning disability, And all of these together, I think, can give us a very, very broad and heterogeneous grouping that I call vulnerabilized persons. Now, what I mean by vulnerabilized persons is persons who, through no fault of their own, are, through life circumstances that can be largely unchosen, have become vulnerable in the ways that we know and try and combat. Their bodies, our bodies, I should say, might be vulnerable. Our minds can be vulnerable. We can be open to exploitation, neglect, or abuse by others. And of course, all of these are features of human life. We are social creatures and we are embodied creatures. So when we live as social, when we interact or turn to other people, we also open ourselves to the possibility of disappointment or being mistreated by those other people. Similarly, when we are embodied, as we all are, we are automatically also open to the possibility that some aspect of our bodies will go wrong in one of the myriad of ways, and that would leave us, again, vulnerabilized. Now, I don't want to naturalize or erase the fact that vulnerability is very largely a feature of the social, economic, and political context in which people find themselves. So people are vulnerabilized through particular healthcare policies, through particular ways in which they are perceived, through prejudice or stereotype, particular ways in which they are marginalized and disenfranchised, and so on. So none of this is inherent. It's a very politically potent message that I'm trying to share here. That this vulnerability is universal, or an illness is near universal, but at the same time, people are differently vulnerabilized given their life circumstances, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. So I don't want the universal nature of vulnerability to erase the diversity and the differential ways in which people are affected by or become vulnerabilized in this talk. So I want us to really bear in mind this idea that it's a heterogeneous group. You can become vulnerabilized through a range of different ways, and that none of them are given, if you like, or natural. So coming back to the paradigmatic case of illness that I want to be focusing on, we can say that illness is near universal, and at the same time, it's also very much ill understood. So people who have not had a major health crisis to themselves or in the life of a close person might have very significant misconceptions about what life with illness or with a disability might be like. And in particular, I'm thinking here of what you might call the outsider view, the ways in which people underestimate the value of such lives and overestimate the barriers and difficulties people with illnesses and disabilities experience. So illness can be a very intimate and private, if you like, affair. And it is something that is not necessarily easy to communicate, and hence can remain, or does remain in many cases, poorly understood. And I think philosophy is a case in point. So what are some of the philosophical questions that exploring illness can help us understand? One important question, crucial in fact, is the question about the relationship between health and its absence and well-being. Or in other words, is it possible to both be ill and flourish? And again, a famous kind of tacit assumption in a lot of discussions of well-being, consider health to be a sine qua non of flourishing. And of course, that is something that we needn't and we shouldn't accept. What aspects of the ill person's life are impacted by illness, and in what ways? What happens to an ill person's social world? How does our self-understanding change in and through illness? So this can, I hope, start to give you a flavor of what is philosophically worthwhile in this in approaching illness. And the other thing that a philosophical exploration of illness can do is illuminate some core features of that experience. So again, I want to really hold on to both the idea that there can be core or general or shared features to illness, but at the same time that it is yet a highly idiosyncratic and subjective experience that depends highly on, again, the healthcare system within which you happen to live, your own psychological state, the kind of life and family and life situation you find yourself in, and so on. Now, why do I think phenomenology is an apt approach here? I think what phenomenology has given us is a really rare opportunity to witness this distinction that is very, very useful, offered by phenomenology, about which more in a second, between disease and illness. So this distinction can do a lot of work because it can help us understand the difference between the patient or first person or narrative or phenomenological perspective and that of biomedicine. So biomedicine, or the clinical medicine or medical science, really focuses on the notion of disease, which is a dysfunction of what you might call the biological or the physical body. So the disease of COVID-19, for example, is caused by the virus that then causes respiratory infection, runny nose, an immune response, and so on. That is the disease. But we also have an experience of that disease, which phenomenologists call illness. And the illness isn't experienced at the level of the physical body, but rather at the level of the lived body. And it's experienced as a disruption. So we disrupt lived bodily experiences when we are ill or they are disrupted. And that can, or need not, but can map onto a disease process. But we have some cases of illness without a biological dysfunction. For example, mild depression is a case where there is a serious disruption of the lived experience, but it's not necessarily mirrored by any disease process. Now, the reason this is so far, existentially so significant and far-reaching is because of this phenomenological fundamental claim that when we change people's physical possibility, we transform their subjectivity, their agency, their intersubjective stance, the way in which we are in the world. And all of these are very, very hard to reduce or capture fully in the language of biomedicine. So what phenomenology calls for, what it advocates, and what it gives us the tools to do is to generate a first-person account of me talking about my, again, idiosyncratic illness experience, how it happened to me, in what way, what effects did it have on various features of my life, in what way did it change my subjectivity or my being in the world. Now, phenomenology, really just one slide just to give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about, is of course a philosophical method that focuses very much on describing what classical phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century called the essential structure of experience. And by essential, he meant something that is necessary in order for us to have that experience. So it might be that something that is an essential structure of the illness experience is pain or feeling of incapacity or inability, or an interruption to our daily activities. Lots of elements. I will give quite a few examples as we go on. Now, what's useful about phenomenology is that it can help us illuminate the quality of subjective experiences and, of course, of subjective illness experiences. And we can see here in the Pierre Bonnard's painting of his wife, who apparently suffered from depression and was treated with hydrotherapy, spent up to 10 hours a day lying in a bath. You can look at that painting and try and get a sense of what he thought her subjective experience might be like, and also, of course, of what his subjective experience of her illness was, as captured in his painting. Not just subjective experiences in the here and now, but also, of course, their personal meanings, what it means to care for an ill person, what it means to become ill yourself, and the way in which they accumulate, or their pattern and coherence over time. So phenomenology is very much not just giving us the opportunity to take a snapshot of somebody's experiences in the moment, but of looking at how these experiences change, grow, develop, what their evolution is over time. I want to take a metaphysically modest stance and not really go too much into the metaphysical commitments or non-commitments a particular phenomenological approach will be, because what I'm really interested in is trying to see whether phenomenology can give us a set of tools that would be useful in our quest to try and understand the experience of illness, rather than delve into phenomenological theory itself. But the biggest, if you like, kind of headline of the phenomenological account of experience is that what we are seeking is to find, if you like, ideal or essential or non-variant elements or structures of experience, or ideal content, again, as Husserl called it, not the causal story. So a phenomenologist would not look at COVID-19 and try and understand how the virus causes an immune response. That's a question for science. A phenomenologist would try and look at COVID-19 and try and find what are the shared features of, for example, having COVID. Now, phenomenology had a keen interest in perception. Some of you may have read Merleau-Ponty's 1945 book, Phenomenology of Perception, which is, I would say, one of the most rewarding reads you could hope to have. I couldn't recommend the book anymore. But in Merleau-Ponty's work, there is a profound and sustained attempt to try and elucidate the sense structure of experience. Not just how do patterns, colors, shapes, sounds come into our consciousness through our senses, but how do we make sense of those experiences? How do we make them cohere into meaningful experiences? And one thing Merleau-Ponty was very busy with, and Husserl too, was in the attempt to elucidate what our pre-reflective lived experience might be. And I've given an example here, well, a photographic example. That's my dog, Laika. And I think I like this photo of hers because I think it really gives a sense of what pre-reflective lived experience is like. She's chasing something, a stick or a ball or a squirrel. And you can see from her face, her gesture, the curve of her spine, the focus of her eyes, that she is intending towards an object. She is completely engaged in this pre-reflective lived experience of chasing something exciting. And I hope this can give you a sense of the extent to which we are caught up, if you like, in this pre-reflective lived experience, and how much we need to slow down. So philosophy, often people say philosophy is thinking in slow motion, to slow down and say, well, what does this experience consist of? How does it come about that a dog can chase a stick somebody throws for her? What things have to be in place in order to enable a dog or a person to have a particular set of experiences? And of course, for humans, the question of how we interpret events, perceptions, associations, and experiences is very much tied to how we live in the everyday world, in the routine and the mundane. And that's another significant focus of phenomenology, is that it's not necessarily looking for dramatic, life-changing, transformative, big experiences, but looking at how we, if you like, cruise pre-reflectively through so many events, perceptions, experiences, thoughts, emotions in our everyday world, and how rare it is that we actually slow down and try and analyze some of those experiences. So I've given you the example of Laika and her, if you like, motor intentionality. You can see how she's intending towards the stick. And of course, the way in which our perceptual experience and subjectivity are entwined can already give us a clue as to what would happen to them when we fall ill, or when those perceptual experiences become limited, changed, fragmented, and so on. And Merleau-Ponty talks about the intentional arc that connects us to the world. So again, if you look at this photo, you can't see the ball or the stick, but you can definitely see that there is an intentional arc connecting this dog's every inch of being to something that's happening in her perceptual field. So that intentional arc, Merleau-Ponty says, is what connects us to the world, is what makes our attention able to come into contact with the world. The big, if you like, philosophical question of how does consciousness encounter a world? Merleau-Ponty's answer is through the intentional arc. An important concept I want to also mention at this point is that of the habitual body, because one thing that becomes radically disrupted in illness is precisely the habitual body, the set of habits and routines we have that make us able to pre-reflectively go through our day. Now, this isn't the exclusive prerogative of able-bodied people, and as an example, I give you Jessica Cox, who's an armless pilot who learned how to fly an airplane using her feet. Now, of course, I feel fairly confident in saying none of us would be able to do that in our lifetimes. But what it gives us is a really nice example of this idea of the habitual body, because the habitual body doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, normal, quote unquote. It can just be the body in how we are used to using it. But the disruption of the habitual body is something that can be seen as the most profound core of the illness experience. When I try to do something and all of a sudden I'm not able to do it, what happens to me then? And this connects us to another Merleau-Pontian concept, that of the body subject. So he thought that the connection or the relationship between our bodies and ourselves, our subjectivity, is so intimate that they simply make one object, one entity, which he called the body subject. And he's trying here very strongly to move away from any Cartesian mind-body dualism. So the body is just the vessel, the body is just the temporary container for this thing we call the soul. Merleau-Ponty rejects that and has a unified, if you like, or holistic account of the human as a body subject. Okay, so we've got this whistle-stop tour of phenomenology more or less in place. I now want to try and think a little bit about what a phenomenology specifically of illness might look like. And I use here a few stills from the film The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, based on Jean-Dominique Bobby's book, which he wrote following a catastrophic stroke he experienced that left him with what's called lockdown syndrome, where he was completely paralyzed in his entire body, barred his left eyelid, which he blinked and used that to communicate and to dictate his book. Now, what a phenomenology of illness does, and again, contrast this with what I said about the causal story that biomedical science tries to understand. And this is not a criticism. Biomedical science, it needs to understand the causal story, because the task of biomedical science is to offer clinical solutions, treatments, interventions for various ailments we experience. So there is, of course, a very respectable and significant room for that. But what I want to emphasize on here is that phenomenology of illness does something completely different. In fact, it focuses on the question how patients experience their disorder. Not what caused the disorder, can the disorder be cured, can the disorder be treated, which treatment option is the best, but how do patients experience their disorder? And of course, it sees that disorder as embodied in the ways I've elucidated, enacted, so carried out in the everyday actions that we try and perform or are unable to perform, used to be able to perform but no longer can, and so on. And then finally situated, again, going back to this idea that there's something deeply idiosyncratic about illness experiences. It is also situated in the unique context, in the unique juncture of, social, political, economic, genetic, familial, geographical, and other variables that create our life situation. So the question now, instead of asking what can cure this disease or how can we best treat it, becomes, for phenomenology, how are embodied states lived as meaningful in an environment? So the embodied states here could be states of illness, disability. You can think about what happens to bodies over time, say in cases of aging, for example, how bodies change, or how we experience that embodiment in a meaningful way or as a meaningful state within a particular environment. And the question of meaning here is extremely significant, because the question of meaning is what allows us to begin in the important quest of telling ourselves, I don't know if you prefer the term, stories, narratives, accounts, reflections on what has happened to our bodies, what has happened to our life as a result of falling ill. Okay, so what can a phenomenology of illness do for us? The first thing is it can offer us this view of a patient as a being in the world, and look at how that being in the world has changed, how one's relationship to one's environment has changed. So the top image is a Pina Bausch dancer in a performance. If you look at the way in which this dancer interacts with the environment, or inhabits space, if you like, the way in which she moves, you can see the profound contrast with the bottom image, which is a very touching scene in the Diving Bell and the Butterfly, in which Bobby's girlfriend dumps him over the phone. Now, he's not able to speak, he can only hear her, and he communicates his messages to relay back to her via the nurse who you're seeing in the image. So the sense of really profound impotence, of inability to shout, to cajole, to put the phone down, really, is very pronounced here. And the contrast between these two shows us the extent to which patiency as a form of being in the world is so varied, is so diverse, can range across so many different contexts. But of course, what is crucial here is that the being in the world of the patient is affected. So the illness, again, is not just a biological dysfunction in my neck, in my joints, in my liver. The illness is the way in which my being in the world is going to be reshaped or remolded in light of the falling ill. And that, of course, affects our goals, our actions, our attunement. So going back to this idea that what we really want to focus on in phenomenology of illness is the illness, the disruption of my lived experience. A few more thoughts before I'm going to try and quickly share with you some models of phenomenological models of illness. The first is the Sartrean claim that illness removes the body's transparency, that in the normal state of affairs, we don't really pay much attention to our bodies. We think, well, our stomachs will digest the breakfast we've eaten, our lungs are going to continue to fill and empty themselves of air. Our spines will continue to hold us upright, and so on. But what happens in illness is that all of a sudden some of these tacit or naive ways of trusting our body can be disrupted. And the illness removes this kind of transparency, the sense of taken for grantedness that we might have in inhabiting a healthy body. And for me, this is also a rare opportunity, if you like. I mean, I am not saying, I've never said or thought that illness is a good thing, that we should seek it as a form of edification, that we should welcome it, or that we should think of it as any of the horrible cliches people sometimes use. It's a journey, it's a gift, it's a test. I don't really buy into any of that. But what I do think is that it's a rare invitation, if you like, to reflect or to philosophize about our bodies and about our being in the world that does have, I think, unique philosophical gains in store. But I'm by no means saying that everybody who falls ill ought to philosophize, or that the philosophizing that arises out of illness in some ways compensates for the terrible losses and costs it inflicts on ill people in many cases. I'm just pointing out that it's a rare opportunity for us to really engage philosophically with bodies, with transformation, and of course with this important distinction between the biological or physiological versus the lived body. We might say in the most general way that illness experiences just redefine our relationship to the world. And I love this painting by Frida Kahlo that I think really shows all the different connections and elements that are tied, through these diverse blood vessels or umbilical cords to her figure lying there in the hospital bed. So illness redefines our relationship to the world, and that's both in the physical sense. So maybe there's a hill that I used to be able to walk up to on the way to the shops, and now I'm no longer able to. The world could be, the psychological or emotional sense of trust and belonging that has been disrupted. The social world can be the way in which people might become prejudiced or awkward around conversations about illness or around meeting people who have become ill. And of course, the temporal changes that can be characterized as this very profound shift from thinking about death as this thing in the future, far away, not something I need to worry about now, to becoming acutely aware of one's temporality, of one's finitude, of one's vulnerability to illness and death. Now, we'll see in a minute, but some phenomenologists such as S.K. Toombs really emphasize this idea that illness is a series of losses, and I'll come to that in a minute. So what I want to do now in the next 10 minutes or so is run you through 4 phenomenological accounts of illness. One that sees illness as a disability or an inability to be. One that considers illness to be an instance of what Heidegger called the breakdown. The third, seeing illness as a form of homelessness. And the fourth, illness as a series of losses, which I just mentioned. So let's start with the first one, illness as disability. So we've got phenomenologists such as Heidegger characterizing human existence as this open set of possibilities, saying, oh, if you want to be a skydiver, it's open to you. If you want to be a hermit, it's also open to you, and all the range of options in between. But existence for Heidegger was primarily a set of open possibilities which we choose to dive into, project ourselves into, or not. Merleau-Ponty refined that by saying, well, possibilities aren't just abstract things. Possibilities are concrete or have to be tied to concrete abilities to perform actions in the world. So if I might want to be a professional skydiver, but if I am too old or my body can't stand this, the intensity of skydiving or whatever, I might not be able to perform the relevant actions in the world that would make being a skydiver a possibility for me. And the third generation, so we got Heidegger, then Merleau-Ponty. Now, Iris Marion Young added to that in her essay, Throwing Like a Girl, that the impact of the ways in which we construct and experience our bodies is really profound, the way it impacts on our motility, our comportment, our spatiality. So possibilities can be closed down, if you like, by these kinds of impacts. And here is an example of such an impact. So if you contrast the professional baseball player on the left and the beauty queen on the right, you can see that genderized ways of throwing or throwing like a girl have concrete consequences in the world. In this case, the ball of the professional baseball player is going to go much farther than the beauty queen throwing. Now, the difference here lies in several things: the way in which they participate or the way in which they embody or enact the action. So you can see the full body pose of the baseball player, how his shoulders and entire body is engaged in the motion, the way in which he's using the lateral dimension of his shoulders to throw. And you contrast that with the, if you like, stereotypically feminine way of throwing, which means isolating the movement from the elbow down, not engaging in the full body movement to assist the trajectory of the ball. And you might say, this, what we're seeing before us is not that girls are born so they throw like girls, but rather girls learn to throw like girls through the ways in which our society might censor or limit or restrict the ways in which women can move in public space, or the ways in which women can use their bodies. So the first account of illness sees it as a disability, of being unable to do particular things, to perform particular actions, and hence to pursue particular possibilities. The second model of illness's breakdown considers, and yeah, I take special pleasure in finding sexist images on the internet and then putting them into my slides and pointing out that the first image that comes up or came up when I put this slide together, when I Googled car breakdown, was of this woman wearing her high heels and clearly waiting for a man to come and rescue her. So this idea of illness as breakdown. And this idea of breakdown comes from Heidegger's tool analysis, in which he talks about breakdown as the situation in which tools become conspicuous. And he says, well, consider a pen, or we can consider Zoom, which is the tool we are using at the moment. And here's the idea. Insofar as things are going well, the tool is inconspicuous. The tool is just the background enabling us, for example, to have this online talk, or the pen enabling us to write the letter to our friend. When we're engaged in the writing, we're thinking about our friends. We're not thinking about the pen. We're thinking about the content of what we're writing. We're not thinking about the pen and the paper and so on. Now, what happens in cases of breakdown, when the tools cease working, is that they become conspicuous, or they become obstinate in precisely this way. And similarly, this model suggests that health is transparent and illness is a case of the body becoming conspicuous in precisely this way. And Sartre, for example, was I think a proponent of this view when he talks about somebody trying to read a book and then they get a headache. And he says, well, that headache is experienced as a disruption to my reading, okay? So I might feel a pang, ignore it and carry on reading, and the headache might get worse and worse until the point where I have to stop reading and say, okay, the headache is now intruding or disrupting my experience of reading a book. And that is exactly the kind of conspicuousness that tools might have in this, as Heidegger describes, in situations of breakdown. I won't go into the question of whether the body is a tool. I'll leave that to another time. The third model is that of illness as homelessness. And this is suggested by Friedrich Svenneus, who's a Swedish philosopher of medicine working in Sweden today. And he talks about the ill body as being unhomelike being in the world, the way in which we might feel lost, uncomfortable, homeless in our bodies in the context of illness. So illness for Svenneus is a form of severe, profound disorientation. And the role of medicine is, if you like, to provide us a way home. So we're not trying to cure or get rid of the illness, which is often just simply not medically possible, but we're trying to find a way to be at home in the world once again. And that is the hallmark of a successful treatment, or one successful treatment. And this gives us a really interesting idea that we can experience health and well-being and flourishing within the context of illness. So going back to what I said in the beginning about the relationship between well-being and flourishing, again, I think we've too quickly for a very long time dismissed the possibility that flourishing within illness is possible, or flourishing within disability is possible. And that is, again, I think a a political goal of social justice to make the case that lives with illness and disability in them are no less valuable and no less capable of being good lives, meaningful lives, valuable lives, flourishing lives than that of healthy or able-bodied people. The fourth model takes us to S.K. Toombs, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, and she, following Husserl, wants to propose that illness has essential characteristics. So what might all these things have in common? An eating disorder, a vomiting bug, diabetes, a cold. These are the features that they all share. They have essential features, and those transcend particular features of different diseases. So of course, having a vomiting bug and having diabetes have very particular and distinctive features from one another. But Toombs is interested in finding the essential features of illness that transcend these particularities. And these essential features, she says, constitute the meaning of illness as we live it. And uncovering these features will enable us to create a shared world of meaning between the ill and the healthy, between ill people themselves. And that's K in the image. And here are the characteristics of illness. As I said, she very astutely points to the 5 losses that characterize, in her view, all of illness. The first is loss of wholeness. The second is loss of certainty. The third is loss of control, loss of freedom to act, and finally, loss of the familiar world. Now, in my book, Phenomenology of Illness, I suggested that not all cases of illness experience all of these losses. So, for example, you could experience the loss of the 4 first one, but still maintain a sense of the familiar world. Or there could be some cases where you could be significantly ill, but not experience a loss of wholeness and so on. Now, going back to this idea of flourishing, I think going back to what I was saying a minute ago, I think what's really valuable, what's really interesting here is to try and grab on to 2 insights that might seem like they're conflicting. On the one hand, that illness is a bad, painful, upsetting, disabling experience. And on the other hand, that the experience could nonetheless be part of a meaningful, valuable, flourishing, and even flourishing lives. And nobody has said it better than, in my opinion, than Harriet Johnson, who's a disability activist in the US, who died a few years ago. And here's what she says: "Are we worse off? I don't think so. For those of us with congenital conditions, disability shapes all we are. Those disabled later in life adapt. We take constraints that no one would choose and build rich and satisfying lives within them." And this is exactly this tension of taking constraints that nobody would choose and nobody has chosen, and yet build rich and satisfying lives within them. Now, I want to very quickly make some concluding comments on the patient and health professional encounter. Now, one thing that can happen, and I think that Phenomenology of Illness is very useful in drawing our attention to, is that the physician construes the illness as a disease state, as a biological dysfunction, while the patient encounters the suffered illness and the disease. They experience the suffering intrinsic to their ill health condition, and also, of course, have a cognitive understanding of the disease process, or can see the disease process when they look at their bodies. So the patient encounters the body as painfully lived, and that can give rise to very different explanatory models that might explain some issues around communication and shared decision-making and feeling of being understood that plagues a lot of encounters between patients and health professionals, and give rise to a lot of misunderstandings. There's a whole other piece of work that I'll just briefly mention that I do, which is on what's called epistemic injustice, which is a way of conceptualizing the way in which somebody can be wronged in their capacity as knowers. So the way in which my first person experience of my illness can be devalued or ignored or not taken seriously by health professionals. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to provide some references after the talk. So what Tombs tells us is that the illness represents two distinct realities or two different worlds with two different meanings, and that there is a really deep gap between patients' experience of illness and the health professionals' view of disease, and how these can come into conflict. So I'll conclude with a quote from Kay. What the phenomenological approach is concerned to show is not simply that the patient's experience should be taken into account as a subjective accounting of an abstract objective reality, but that the patient's experiencing must be taken into account because such lived experience represents the reality of the patient's illness. And that idea that these first-person accounts of vulnerabilized persons are valuable because they are not a second-hand account of some objective reality, which is ultimately the goal, the thing we're after, but rather that this experiencing is the lived experience, the reality of the patient's illness, and that's the thing that Phenomenology of Illness allows us to focus on. So thank you very much. As I said, I'd be really happy to share PDFs of any papers. The list here, I would there's newer stuff. All the stuff on epistemic injustice and vulnerabilized bodies is the newer stuff I've been working on recently. But also I've tried to provide a very systematic, more in-depth account of a phenomenology of illness in the OUP book. And I also wrote another book that I'll just say one thing about, because I know a lot of people in the audience are from literature and maybe have thought about what might be called autoethnography or autofiction as ways of conveying experiences of illness. But my book, The Top One Illness, is really an attempt to write about my own experiences of falling ill, and marrying that. That was my first attempt to bring phenomenology into the picture as a robust tool for understanding my own experiences. So again, just to raise that in case that's something that's of interest to people in the audience, I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Havi. That was an incredibly insightful, moving and rich talk, and it resonated with me personally. It resonated with me from the point of view of my work too. And I just having a look here, and we've got some questions coming in. But just before we go to questions from our fantastic audience, I'd just like to maybe ask a couple of questions to kick us off. I'm so fascinated by the way that a phenomenology of illness offers an opportunity for constructing a new and tender language and understanding, especially around chronic illness experience. And as a person who lives with a chronic illness that, probably won't kill me, but yet is sort of difficult to, it's kind of managed, but there's no cure. I kind of sit, and as many of us do who have chronic illnesses, we sit in this strange sort of intermediary space in medicine in which we become emergent if we have, a flare or an urgent situation with our bodies, but otherwise we occupy this strange space. And in fact, we occupy this space, I think, very much of death is not yet. It's the sort of awareness of the vulnerability, as you say, of our bodies and the proximity to collapse that we occupy. But yet death is still something that remains abstracted from us as we try and negotiate what it means to sit in this intermediary space. So I was thinking as you were speaking about how much the denial of the lived experience of illness has impacted medical knowledge over its history, especially when it comes to chronic disease. And I was thinking not only about what phenomenology can offer, or a phenomenology of illness can offer in terms of understanding patient and privileging patient experience, but also what a phenomenological model of insight into illness might offer the biomedical model. Like what kind of, for so long, for centuries, we have missed out on really important and crucial insights, especially into chronic illness, because patient experience has been disavowed, because patient experience doesn't speak to these objective, clinically demarcated, scientifically sanctioned forms of knowledge. So I'm just really interested in the way that, you know, what you think about how a phenomenology of illness can really inform and redress these blind spots in the biomedical understanding of chronic illness.
Thanks, Elinor. That's super interesting and spot on. I think you're absolutely right that what's interesting about phenomenology and what hasn't quite, I think, been articulated enough, and I've tried to do in a couple of places, but more can be done, is the politicized nature of phenomenology. Right? Phenomenology is the tool that can spur patients to consider their first-person experiences as valuable, as significant, indeed as essential to the clinical work they'll be doing with their health professionals. So you're absolutely right that phenomenology isn't just a kind of theoretical account. I said earlier, I talked about how Husserl thought it was a philosophical method for describing, but the power of describing is that it can make salient, is that it can make accessible, is that it can bring to the forefront of people's minds what is actually going on for people. And we all know how moving it is when you hear an illness or, you know, another account of somebody saying, this is what happened to me. It could be, again, think about the broader category of vulnerabilized persons. It could be an asylum seeker. It could be somebody whose house has been bombed in Gaza or in Syria. It could be a woman who's being, you know, sexually harassed on the street. And there are a lot of, you know, I think phenomenologically inspired political projects like that. So, for example, the Everyday Sexism Project is just women saying, I was trying to go to work, here's what happened to me. I was trying to have a nice night out, here's what happened to me. And sometimes those testimonies, we think of them as mundane and trivial, and we think, well, everybody, you know, stuff happens to everybody, and it's true, but the mundane and the trivial of one person can be very surprising and, if you like, bring about change for somebody else. So the idea that, you know, people who suffer from ill health or chronic ill health have voices, that voices need to be heard, that voices and expressions and testimonies and narratives have to be taken seriously. That's a claim that not all, I think, health professionals would accept. And of course, now we're seeing very much this language of patient-centered care and patient satisfaction and so on. But at the end of the day, we still continue to have patient complaints and catastrophes and injustices carried out in health facilities worldwide and specifically within the UK, where clearly this isn't a job that's going to be finished at any point. It is just an understanding or a particular approach that phenomenology gives us that says we need to listen to these first-person reports and accounts, and they are essential to our attempt to understand what is actually gone wrong for the person.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating, because this idea of listening, you know, when we talk about healthcare, especially for vulnerable, marginalized, disenfranchised people, we often talk about the inability of our healthcare systems to listen, or our healthcare providers to listen, which of course is partly a systemic problem due to lack of that clinician or healthcare provider's time, a lack of funding, a lack of knowledge, which of course, you know, stem from systemic issues that need to urgently change. But I think there's sometimes this sense that listening is just, you know, an act of human decency that it can't really be integrated meaningfully as a form of knowledge, or that it's something like, you know, putting a hand on a shoulder rather than actually changing a form of understanding. But of course, listening is so much more than just giving someone space to voice. It's also an act of empathy in its truest sense. And, you know, when we talk about lived experience, you just mentioned things like patient satisfaction surveys. You know, it's this kind of gesture towards including patient voices, but yet what that's then doing is funneling that voice into this kind of consumer capitalist productive model where you can, you know, have tick boxes, rather than this active, profoundly human exchange, which happens when voicing and listening is active and it's part of, you know, an active kind of clinical practice. And of course, you know, failing to listen means missing out on really important sources of knowledge, you know, and it feels as well that, you know, medicine, of course, over its history is heteropatriarchal, and it has privileged forms of knowledge that are objective, scientific, and it has disavowed forms of knowledge that we would now think of as gendered or from the ground up. So feeling, a sense of feeling, a sense of bodily experience that doesn't fit into, you know, a strict clinical code or a list of symptoms and signs. Yeah, I was just thinking about the way we could, you know, construct a sort of code of ethics for the care of the chronically unwell people, of disabled people, that prioritized, you know, listening as a kind of, as an act of meaningful change, and as you said earlier, as a politicized act as well, as something that consciously uses empathy. But you know, in your fantastic book, Illness, you talk about empathy, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that too, just for, and then I will move on to some of our great questions.
Sure, thanks, Elinor. So I think one reaction that I sometimes get is people say, oh, you know, all this touchy-feely stuff about phenomenology and first-person experiences, oh, health professionals just don't have time for that nonsense. But I think seeing it as touchy-feely is incredibly naive, because in fact, as you rightly pointed out, enabling health professionals to occupy the stance of listening is in itself a political act. Giving people tools, phenomenological tools. So I have something I call the patient toolkit, which is a way that helps, is a tool for patients to be able to articulate their illness experience. I see that very much as a political tool. And I think the more we empower, enable people to speak, to describe, to tell, to share, the less, you know, stigmatized and embarrassing those kinds of experiences will become. And we've seen that in, you know, in the way particular, you know, say gendered terms of female anatomy. Oh no, people can hardly bring themselves to say the word vagina or vulva. And again, the more we give language, the more we give space to speech of that sort to take place, then we start to redress the imbalance, or start to increase the amount of listening, not just listening, but also taking seriously. So I think this whole idea that this approach is touchy-feely and holistic and all that completely misses the point. This is a political project of advocating, empowering, and inviting people to articulate their experiences, and saying no experience is too shameful and too embarrassing. And indeed, when we dispel prejudice and stereotype, we make the possibility of talking about certain experiences, for example, the experience of being a victim of domestic violence, become possible. And that's a hugely you know, political, and I think very very potent approach. So I always find this idea that this is touchy-feely stuff a very limited understanding. And then just to say one more thing about what you said about touching somebody on the shoulder and empathy, again, that's not just being nice to a patient. That is a moral stance that as a health professional you might take towards the people you are caring for. And similarly, other types of decisions and behaviors we have are not just you know, conforming to norms or social niceties. They are moral choices we make as individuals. So we need to, I think, see them in their fullness, and I think phenomenology can help do that.
Thank you so much, Havi. So I'm going to move on to the questions. We have a question from Sabina, and her question is, their question is, What is the difference between this phenomenological approach to illness and the social, in parentheses, or economic model of disability? And do you see this idea of the vulnerabilized body as akin to Jasbir Puer, and sorry if I've mangled that pronunciation, notion of debility? I think, Havi, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Just as well, because I didn't say anything good. So, yeah, thank you, Sabine. So I was saying I'm not a disability scholar, but my understanding is that social model of disability sees disability as arising from social barriers and not from the bodily impairment as such. Again, I'm no expert on this, so if somebody else wants to jump in, please do. But I think this is something that's quite different to the phenological approach, because the phenological approach is not prescriptive. It doesn't say, oh, this is what illness says. It says, these are the kinds of questions we need to ask, or these are the kinds of viewpoints we need to occupy in order to start understanding what illness is. So it's very much not saying, so social models of disability is social barriers. The phenomenology of illness doesn't say illness is this thing or that thing. It just says, so Toombs, for example, says, here are these features that apply to all illnesses. Somebody else says, oh, here's this metaphor of homelessness or breakdown or this dash ability. And just using those frameworks in order to study and phenomenologize the experiences of illness. Now, do I see the idea of vulnerabilized body as akin to the notion of debility? I don't know Jasper Puer's notion of debility, so it's hard for me to say, but I'll certainly follow this up. What the idea of the vulnerabilized body, I first came across the term in a blog post by Shelley Tremaine, where she talks about the way in which we've become very accustomed to talking about vulnerable people in the pandemics. Oh, saying, oh, you're vulnerable, so you should shield. And she was simply pointing out that nobody's vulnerable. People are just vulnerabilized by particular ways in which they're, for example, institutionalized in a care home or incarcerated in a prison. So she says, nobody's inherently vulnerable. This is just something that happens to people, that is done to people by others, as it were.
Thank you, Havi. And we have a question, really interesting question from Darian Golding-Stahl, who asks, does S.K. Toombs' illness as a series of losses discount the flourishing that can also occur within illness?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Darian. I think, I don't want to do Kay an injustice. I think her approach would be at odds with the idea of flourishing within illness that I suggested. But I think Kay was trying to articulate, I mean, her work dates back to the late 80s and early 90s. She was a real pioneer in trying to articulate what is it that happens to somebody when they fall ill. And I think it is true that it is a series of losses. You do lose your sense of certainty, your sense of control, and so on, as I explained. Now, the question of flourishing within illness, I think that came to me through thinking particularly about chronic illness and thinking particularly about a model that I read about in nursing literature, which is called the foreground background model. And the idea here is that, I think a little bit like what Elinor was saying, in chronic illness, there can be long periods of stability where the illness just recedes to the background. It's not that the person is cured. It's simply that it doesn't play a big role in their everyday business. So they just go about living their lives and the illness is in the background. And then, of course, there'll be periods in which it will come to the foreground. For example, in cases in symptom exacerbation or disease progression or flare-up, and then it will be in the foreground. But the possibility of being ill and happy, as I put it in one of my older papers, is really one that strikes a lot of people as counterintuitive. You're saying, oh, if you're chronically ill, how could you possibly be happy? And yet people adapt to the most demanding and taxing circumstances and find a space of flourishing within that. So I want to really, very strongly advocate that we need to pay attention to that, and we need to realize that the human capacity for adaptation is absolutely remarkable. Now, the adaptation doesn't mean that the losses haven't happened. It just means that they can be reconfigured into a life that is still one of value and flourishing.
Thank you so much, Havi. And Rebecca Rosenberg has a question that I think she would like to ask herself.
Yeah, sure. I sent it as like a private message because I was like mildly ashamed of it, but it's fine. I'll say it out loud. So yeah, thank you for your talk, Havi. I was kind of like furiously making notes, but you mentioned autofiction at the end of your talk, and since autofiction, as I'm sure you know, can be like quite a deliberate, playful, knowing mix of like fiction and autobiography, and many practitioners of autofiction have been accused of like being disingenuous and like quote unquote like lying. And I was just wondering, what are the ethics in autopathographies for you in terms of like the truth of lived experience? And I appreciate I'm not a philosophy student, so that's probably a massive question. Or does it kind of not matter in the context of autofictional autopathographies if there is this mix, because it's maybe potentially the sincerity behind the autofictional autopathography that matters, rather than this deliberate mix of fiction and autobiography.
Oh wow, thanks. That's so interesting. I think you probably will have more to say about it than I do necessarily. I mean, I talked about narratives and testimonies. I think the characteristic of testimonies is indeed that of sincerity, right? So a testimony, to my mind, is not somebody trying to manipulate, but somebody saying, this is my opinion, or this is how it is for me. And I think, again, going back to this idea that patient questionnaires give us the information we want, they do in some cases, but the way in which we solicit information and the sources from which we obtain it is really important. So pathographies, there's so many of them, and of course, this goes back to the idea that illness is embodied, enacted, and situated, and each one of them really gives us the life situation of the person who's writing the account. So mine was sort of laced with philosophy because that was my life as a philosopher, and that was what I knew. For other people, it'd be something completely different. The level of playfulness and the way in which we could play with narratives, or the things we could do with them, I think it potentially could be, creative and open-ended. My work on epistemic injustice really focused on finding uptake for testimonies, rather than thinking about these more kind of elaborate forms of patient or ill person's accounts. But I think that richness probably seems to me like a good thing. What happens in cases of deception? I mean, again, within the context of the literature on epistemic injustice, that would be taken not to be an offer of testimony, but an offer of something else, maybe a literary effort or something like that. But I'd be happy to hear if you have more thoughts about that, because as a philosopher, as a non-literary person, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Havi, and thanks, Rebecca, for your fantastic question. We have a question from Joe, who asks, to what extent do you think a phenomenological approach would also help us understand the experience of the clinician and the clinician's body as it is constructed by a healthcare system and the act of care itself?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Hello. Absolutely. I mean, I talked about first-person accounts of ill persons, but we also have the first-person accounts of the clinicians and of course the clinician's body and the clinician's emotions. And one of the things that forever continue to baffle me about medicine is how the whole system is constructed so that so little attention is paid to the clinician's body. And I'll just give a quick example. My son used to swim when he was little. He had swimming lessons with this other kid. And all of us, we'd bring sort of thick towels and snacks and water bottles and warm clothes. So we'd turn up with all this gear for our little kids who came out of the swimming pool cold. Then there was one dad who never brought his kid a snack. And he just expected the kid to sort of put their clothes on and march out of the pool. There were no niceties, no sort of lots of rubbing with a soft towel and so on. And then he told me he was a medic. And he said, when you're trained to be a medic, you learn to ignore your body in so many ways. You're not allowed to be disgusted. You're not allowed to be upset. You're not allowed to go to the toilet in the middle of a ward round. You're not allowed to say that you're feeling faint if you're, in a operating theater. And he said, I've become the kind of person who just doesn't hardly feel hunger or cold or tired at all. And I thought it just stuck in my mind because I think it really touches on this, I would say, cruelty of the healthcare system to its own health professionals who are called upon so often to deny their own bodily experiences. And I remember once reading a paper, I'm so sorry, I never managed to find that paper again, but it was about the sense of smell and disgust. And I don't know if you've ever, I used to sometimes, when opportunity arises, shadow clinicians, and it always just amazes me. And one time I was shadowing this guy, and then there was a patient who said, I've got like an abscess in my leg. And he said, I really want to show it to you. And the doctor said, yeah, okay. And he stripped it back. And I just took a step back because it was such a big wound. And it was just, you could see right through to the bone. And I felt really overwhelmed by this. But the clinician didn't bat an eyelid. He just looked at it and he said, yeah, we could do this, we could do that, wrap it, bandage it back up. And afterwards I asked him, and he said, the first thing you learn is to check your responses so that you're not actually reacting, but you're constantly censoring yourself. No, I'm not tired, I'm not hungry, I'm not impatient, I'm not disgusted. And that's a very anti-phenomenological action, if you like, and it's also kind of inhumane in much ways. In many ways. So I think the clinician's body, as it is constructed by the health system and the act of care itself, and we can problematize this notion of care for a very long time. I think you're spot on, Joe, that phenomenology could really also help in that respect. So, sorry, slightly lengthy anecdote, but really stuck in my mind that this poor kid never got a snack after swimming.
That's too much. Thank you for your question, Jen. Thank you for your answer, Havi. I think we have a question from Ben. If you'd like to share your question.
Oh yeah, thanks very much. And thanks so much, Havi. I love that. That was fascinating. And I'm going to look more into all of those references that you talked about. I was just wondering about this distinction you made between the biological body and the lived body. And I was wondering, how much, in your kind of own conception of the phenomenology of illness, how much is there a kind of reverse feedback from the lived body onto the biological body? Like, could you talk about, I don't know, like how does the biological body feel about how the lived body is reacting? And also, can you think about that as having biological consequences on the biological body? I mean, it's quite controversial idea, I guess. Like in healthcare, I've heard a lot of kind of people talking about, well, positive patients have better health it improves the patient's health outcome or something like that, which I'm kind of like a bit suspicious of, because I feel like it makes people feel guilty for experiencing their illnesses or for expressing their suffering or something like that. But this idea that positive experience has a positive feedback on the biological body, and yeah, is there a phenomenology of the biological body itself that experiences the lived body or even changes because of the lived body?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's super interesting. You're in Paris, right?
Yeah.
So I'll invoke Sartre here, and his idea of the three orders of the body, which I think would work as a decent analogy here. So he says, well, I have an experience of myself. I have, of course, the experience of other people. I also have the experience of other people experiencing me, right? So in the famous example in Being and Nothingness of the peeking through the keyhole. So I'm looking through the keyhole, I'm looking into a room I'm not supposed to be watching some intimate scene taking place in there. And all of a sudden, I hear somebody behind me, and I become somebody who's being observed, observing somebody else, okay? And then there's the third layer of saying, it's not just that I perceive myself, I perceive others to perceive me, but then also I perceive myself as a being that is perceived by others who perceive me, okay? And that's the third order. And there's a constant, kind of dialectic going on between these different dimensions. So I'm constantly updating my sense of myself in response to how you respond to me, and in response to how I think you think I am, if you see what I mean. And this could go on for quite a while, right? We could add further layers to it. Now, if we think about the lived body feeding back into the biological body, for sure the lived body can incorporate or experience the biological body. So I don't know if you've ever had something, not you specifically, but all of us have had an experience where you suddenly see, I don't know, like a wart or something on your skin, a new mole, and you go like, what is that? And that's exactly, a physiological phenomenon, something on your skin coming into your consciousness and affecting your lived experience. So certainly, there could be that interplay, or we can be really attentive to the ways in which we experience our bodies as objects in the world. So when you get, you put on your nicest clothes and you go and look in the mirror, you're trying to see yourself, not as you see yourself, right? You're trying to see yourself as others might see you. So similarly, our bodies, if we go into a CT scanner or have to align our limbs for an X-ray in a particular angle, for example, that can be exactly such a moment of, if you like, objectification or alienation from one's body, where you think, actually, this is a mechanical machine. This is a, if you like, a physiological machine that does stuff. And I've got this really, really awkward, complicated relationship with it. So I think you can certainly have that kind of thing going on. So a phenomenology of how the lived body has this dual relationship to the physical body. It's an object, but it's also me. That's precisely the Merleau-Pontian idea of the body subject. Can the biological body react biologically to the lived experience? I think yes, in the maybe slightly disappointing sense that, we know that if you have lots of experiences of distress, for example, your cortisol levels could become chronically elevated, and that can cause further down the line all kinds of nasty effects like, cardiovascular disease. So yes, there are these, intimate connections between the two of them. And I didn't want to also give the misleading sense that there are two bodies here. This is one body and two perspectives on it. So of course, or two ways of viewing it, if you like. So of course they will have these intimate connections. But that's a really, really interesting question. I'll think about it more, and I hope the analogy to Sartre here helps a little bit.
Thanks very much.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much, Ben, for your question, and thanks, Havi, for your answer. I have a comment from Linda Miller that she's asked me to read out, because the audio is not so great, and I think this is a really interesting one. Many healthcare practitioners, devote themselves to a vocation in medicine because of personal or close family experience of illness or disability. The healthcare practitioner suffers a testimonial injustice because professional codes prohibit disclosure of shared experience. To generalize that all healthcare practitioners do not listen or act compassionately is a simplistic generalization, which is unjust to the individual practitioner. This definition of healthcare as a homogeneous, unlistening patriarchy needs closer exploration. In the UK, more practitioners are female, and actually surveys rate doctors very highly in terms of listening and compassion. Communication skills training is embedded in the curriculum. Rigorous annual appraisal with feedback from patients is an essential part of practice. There is a danger of inflicting moral injury and generalizing about healthcare practitioners as inhumane, particularly with their losses this year. I'd just like to say something in response. It's a really great point that I know that in my own work, when I talk about some of the injustices embedded within our medical system, that I'm always talking about systemic and cultural issues, not necessarily directing an attack on individual practitioners at all. Medicine is a system of power. It's historically been a system of power that's privileged certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of practice over others. And this isn't an attack on some of the incredibly compassionate, empathetic and brilliant clinicians working in healthcare practice today. They're up against an awful lot in terms of funding, in terms of, research funding and knowledge, and in terms of what they have the time to do, especially in light of something like the pandemic. So I would always stress that when I talk about, a sort of lack of listening that might be present in clinical practice, this is often a systemic one, and maybe it's definitely not an attack on individuals. A lot of prejudices in medicine, just like prejudices in society, sit above the level of individual prejudice and are reflections of systemic culture and social biases. So yeah, I would always say it's systemic and not the fault of individuals. So anyway, I see what you, if you have anything to add, Havi. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Linda, that was very much not my intention to attack healthcare practitioners of any kind. What I was referring to was cases like the Mid Staffordshire inquiry that highlighted failings that I don't think it is possible to describe them in any other language other than to say they were cases of terrible lack of compassion and lack of listening and neglect. And maybe there were local reasons that perpetuated that kind of behavior. But what the target of what I'm speaking about here is actually institutions and not individuals. And I think if you look indeed at hermeneutical injustice, that is also something that operates at the level of, social groups and linguistic frameworks rather than at the level of the individual. I think individuals, sorry, it's a bit of noise here. I hope it's not coming through to you. Individuals operate in the context of a system. And what I'm interested in in the work on epistemic injustice is to consider the ways in which institutions vulnerabilize individuals, and the ways in which institutional processes, local cultures, and local routines and norms can be harmful. So here's another example. So I think many of us have heard about the high number, I think it's something like 69 cases of suicide and attempted suicide that were linked to particular changes that were made to the benefit claiming system in the UK. So the Department of Work and Pensions moved to universal credit and PIP payments and everything that happened as a result. And if you look at some of the individual cases of people who took their own lives as a result of their benefits being stopped and the reasons why that happened, then at the end of the day, you can say, well, somebody here was saying that, I'm thinking of one particular case of a woman who was actually in hospital and wasn't able to attend an appointment in the job center, and then her benefits were stopped. I'm thinking here really of people have very reduced resilience, very limited capacity to find their way within an institution, and what I call institutional opacity. So big bureaucratic institutions that make navigating within them, the very people they're meant to serve, make that a very difficult task for them. So I'm really much more interested here at the way in which institutions, say, standardize who their beneficiaries or users are, the way in which institutional processes might mean that this particular individual had a letter from the DWP about their benefits, but was actually in hospital, and nobody managed to sort of pick that up. And the way in which things like that, when they go wrong, I don't think it's sufficient to say, oh, it was a bureaucratic error, it was a problem with our system, or whatever. Because at the end of the day, somebody died, and maybe that death was preventable, maybe that death wasn't necessary. So I think what we want to do is keep hold again of two things. On the one hand, the profound moral commitment that and compassion that you point to in cases of individual health professionals, many of whom completely have that commitment and that ethos, but then the institutional opacity that can mean that in some cases people are not able to navigate the system, people are not able to find what they need within the system, and the institution, if you like, it can let them down. There's lots of other parallel cases outside of healthcare that I could speak about. And also, if you're actually interested in that particular issue, I've just recently finished a paper about this issue of what I call institutional opacity, and the ways in which institutions can make the very people they are meant to serve feel that they are impenetrable, opaque, epistemically difficult to navigate, and so on. But thank you for your comment. I think there's a lot of value in reminding ourselves of the individuals who provide healthcare to all of us. So thank you, Linda.
Yeah, and thank you, Linda, for your comment, and Havi, your answer. I think we can all agree that a lived phenomenology of illness helps us to radically rethink the humanity in all of us on both sides of the patient-clinician dynamic, for example. I think we might have time for maybe one more question. If anyone does anyone have a last question they'd like to put to Havi?
No, we don't.
You can add in the chat, or you can raise your hand or unmute, let me know. Okay, if there aren't any further questions, I would like to say a huge thank you to Havi Carel for this incredibly rich and really thought-provoking. Have we got questions? We've got hands raising all over the place. Fantastic. Okay, there's hands raising. Right, let's see. We can probably run until for about another just 9 minutes or so. So I don't know the order that the hands were raised in. I know that we had, so could you raise your hands again for me, please, if you'd like to ask a question? Where have the hands gone? I know that there are Rebecca. Oh, you were clapping. Okay, I'm so sorry. People were clapping. I don't know how Zoom works. Apologies. Yeah, so if there aren't any other questions, I'm sure we can all clap our hands and thank Havi for this really extraordinary and fascinating talk, and also to thank the organisers of Contemporary Women's Writing in the Medical Humanities online conference. And I would like to extend so many thanks to all of you for joining in our discussions today and listening so intently to Havi's talk. I really could talk about the issues that she raised for hours. So thank you so much, Havi, and thank you to everyone today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the lovely comments in the chat. That's hugely appreciated. And thank you for inviting me again, and have a good rest of the day.
Hi everyone, welcome to this panel this morning. I'm delighted to see that so many of you have been able to join us, and I hope that you're all keeping well in the ongoing circumstances in which we find ourselves. In the chat, you will see that Alice has just posted the kind of housekeeping for Zoom etiquette, etc. We are recording, so I'm just going to briefly go over these. So please ensure that your camera is off. During the question section, you can raise your hand or you can write your question in the chat. I'm sure we all know this now. And we will be making this session available online after the event. We've got subtitles that should be running. And I think that that's everything that I need to say. I'm so delighted to introduce Amaleena, who is here today for this brilliant paper entitled Falling Forever, Falling to Pieces, Embodiment, Memory, and Narrative Relationality in Contemporary Birth Stories. For those who don't know who Amaleena is, where have you been? She is the Associate Professor in French at Durham University. Her research interests reside in questions of embodiment, affect, gender, sexuality, and race in contemporary French and Francophone literature and philosophy. She is the author of The Becoming of the Body, Contemporary Women's Writing in French, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2014, and has co-edited with Jill Rye 3 major books on 21st century women's writing in French. Amaleena is currently working on a monograph on the politics of consumption in Francophone Mauritian author Ananda Devi's writing, funded by a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship. She is also developing a cross-cultural project on contemporary narratives of birth, including scholarly and creative writing. I'm delighted to hand over to Amaleena now, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for that very generous introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today, albeit in this disembodied form that we've all become accustomed to. Huge thank you to Ben and Becky for inviting me to talk today and for putting together such an amazing program. It's been so far so vibrant and expansive, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conference. As Jasmine has just outlined, I'm currently working on 2 projects. The first of which is a monograph on the politics of consumption in and through the work of Francophone Mauritian author Ananda Devi. And I'm interested in this work in thinking about some of the major issues that are confronting us in the world today. So thinking about colonialist legacy, capitalist excess, resurgent racism, persistent gender equality, ecological collapse. I mean, so not much then, but drawing all of these concerns together through the frame of this idea of the politics of consumption. So I'm interested in looking at food pathways and global flows of consumption and patterns of eating from the everyday to the extreme. And as part of this project, I'm looking quite substantially at disordered eating disorders and disorderly eating. So I was originally thinking that I might talk about that project today, but in the end, I've decided instead to talk to you about my second project, which I would say I describe as more of my kind of slow burn project. It's something that I've been thinking about for a while, but which is still sort of in slow development. And that's my project on cultural narratives of birth. So as you can see, my interests lie in contemporary women's writing, but very much at the intersection with the medical humanities. And the Birth Project is something around which I'm developing scholarly work. I'm also doing some creative writing, and I hope in the future to do some collaborative work as well. I'm going to share my screen now so that I can just get my PowerPoint up. Can everyone see that? Just shout if you can't. Great, fantastic. So there's a very small change to my title, Falling Forever, Falling to Pieces. I've added one word: knowledge, embodied memory, and narrative relationality in contemporary birth stories. So my interest in birth narratives was initially sparked by personal circumstance. While preparing for the birth of my first living child, now over 6 years ago, I was struck by not being able to find things to read that were quite what I was looking for. Birth manuals seemed inevitably to fall into what I felt were quite polarized categories, either on the one hand very medicalized, or on the other promoting alternative, natural, or so-called positive discourses of birth. And I found tons of helpful information in both categories, lots of helpful medical detail about the process of labour in the former category, lots of useful information in the latter, as well as in the latter category, empowering stories and ultimately very useful techniques for going through the process of birth. But it all just felt so oppositional. And from a feminist perspective, there were, and I think there are still, so many things with which I felt I needed to take issue. And I came away from all of this reading with the feeling that either one is reduced in pregnancy and birth to being an object of medical discourse, or otherwise one is reduced to one's nature. So I want to begin today's talk by just exploring that idea a little bit further, thinking about that polarization as a way of providing some context for my analysis. So the forms of knowledge about birth that circulate most widely in contemporary culture are arguably birth preparation manuals. And these have been historically criticised by feminists for being dominated by patriarchal perspectives in which the birthing body is culturally determined by notions of suffering as a natural female destiny or as punishment, and viewed as passive or regulated by a patriarchal medical gaze. Since the Enlightenment, the birthing body has been subject to scrutiny and surveillance. And until the 1970s, birth in most Western countries has been highly institutionalized. You'll see on this slide, I should have mentioned this earlier, there are some photographic images of birth this is a photograph actually of the photographs that I took at an exhibition at the Whitney Museum that's some about 5 years ago now. And on the next slide, which we'll get to now. Yeah. Next slide, you've got various artistic images of birth itself. Most of these within the medical setting. So since the Enlightenment, this is the images are just there to give you some sort of, to spark your imagination, if you like. Since the Enlightenment, the birthing body has been subject to scrutiny and surveillance. Until the 1970s, birth in most Western countries has been highly institutionalized. Birthing person in a supine position, legs in stirrups, with medical interventions such as forceps a routine part of the procedure. In her detailed historical analysis of the submission of the birthing body to patriarchal medicalization, Adrienne Rich writes that the real issue underlying the economic profit of the medical profession is the mother's relation to childbirth, an experience in which women have historically felt out of control, at the mercy of biology, fate, or chance. To change the experience of childbirth means to change women's relationship to fear and to powerlessness, to our bodies, to our children. It has far-reaching psychic and political implications. So since the 1970s, the time at which Rich was writing, considerable attention has been paid to the ways that the medicalization of birth, though initiated as a response to the very real threats posed to parent and infant survival as living conditions worsened under industrialization, have inevitably constructed birthing mothers and people as objects of medical knowledge rather than subjects with their own knowledge and agency. So what we've seen is a kind of rebuttal of medicalization, and discourses of birth began to emerge, which encouraged taking back control of the body and encouraged viewing birth as a normal process in the fabric of human existence rather than some kind of medical event. Discourses began to emerge that also viewed birth as a process that could be empowering. So Anne Oakley, for example, calls for a feminist project of control over one's body, writing that the medicalization of childbirth has changed the subjective experience of reproduction altogether, making dependence on others instead of dependence on self a condition of the achievement of motherhood. You have on the next slide some images of some prominent birth practitioners, activists, and writers. The British anthropologist Sheila Kitzinger, for example, whose psychosexual method emphasizes the need for women to trust in their own instincts and suggests that birth can be a sensuous and exhilarating experience. Kitzinger's work, along with that of the midwife Ina May Gaskin, who's also on the slide, and the French doctor Michel Audin, has been hugely influential in creating the birth manuals of today. I love to show this slide because I think that picture of Michel Audin fully dressed in the birthing pool is just quite wonderful. I'm not really quite sure what he's doing, but it never fails to make me smile. All of these people have been hugely influential in creating the birth manuals of today. And you can see some examples of today's popular birth manuals on the next slide. Such manuals tend to suggest that empowerment can be found in resisting pain relief. They tend to emphasize bodily agency and birthing choices, drawing on the language of taking back control, eliminating fear, and confronting cultural mythologies, all with the aim of giving birth with least medical intervention possible. These manuals also suggest that empowerment can be found in resisting pain relief and in opening oneself up, quite literally, to the experience of birth through breathing techniques and self-hypnotherapy. What I have found quite striking about the language in such manuals is that taking back control of the body seems to require at the same time what is often referred to as shutting down the neocortex. We are all animals, one is told. All one needs to do to experience a natural, normal birth is to connect with one's primal self. Now, the effectiveness of such advice can be seen in the huge popularity of hypnobirthing and natal hypnotherapy, along with ample statistical evidence that such techniques do in fact lead to quicker, safer, less compromised birth experiences. And yet, as a feminist, one can't help but balk at the suggestion that empowerment can be achieved by shutting off one's mind, and also by re-entering into a so-called primitive, and you'll note, of course, here the racialized language too, which you can see on the poster on the left-hand side of the slide, by entering into this primitive relationship with one's body. There is, as Alison Phipps notes, an unapologetically biologically essentialist narrative here that seems to exist in tension with a feminist agenda of taking back control. As Phipps argues, there have developed in recent years certain regimes of truth around birth and breastfeeding that emphasize a lack of intervention and that promote the natural and normal in ways that may provide the illusion of empowerment, while masking an enduring politics of subordination, as well as a neoliberal commodification of birth and parenting. Agendas, Alison Phipps writes, which began in feminist efforts to empower women, have now been transformed into messages which can put pressure on mothers in a number of different ways, while also excluding other caregivers. So these discourses are often aimed at a privileged white middle-class group of mothers with abundant cultural, social, and economic capital. And this new reproductive activism, Phipps argues, arguably romanticizes the natural promise of personal empowerment and the attainment of ideal motherhood, while coexisting with the absence of sufficient structural support for mothers and parents, serving then to vilify those with less access to resources, as well as those who come to be parents in different ways, including queer, trans, and non-binary parents. So, from this sort of brief survey of discourses of birth, I want to give the sense then that the polarization of such discourses, the medical on the one hand and the rebuttal of medicalization on the other, misses the opportunity, I think, to provide genuinely empowering forms of knowledge. That's the important word here, knowledge about birth, that account for the centrality of a woman or a person's body to giving birth, without at the same time reducing them to a fixed or essentialist idea of nature, or indeed that address the very many different circumstances in which birth may occur. So I've ended up being very interested in this question of knowledge, and the kinds of knowledge that circulate around birth, how birth enters into knowledge, and also how birthing women and people can navigate a meaningful relationship with knowledge as they go through this transformative embodied event that is birth. So where else do we look for birth stories? How else do we conceptualize the experience of birth? Well, naturally, I ended up looking to my own field, which is contemporary women's writing in French. And here it is striking that though motherhood is represented, as those of you in the field will know, motherhood is represented a very rich and varied theme in so much recent writing. Birth itself tends to be relatively overlooked. Jill Rye, whose pioneering narratives of mothering has ushered in a wave of scholarly analysis of depictions of mothering in French, observes that there have been historically very few women-authored stories, birth stories in literature. She writes, childbirth narratives tend to be either male authors' accounts of their own birth or audience-based narratives such as obstetrics manuals or the accounts of a bystander or an omniscient narrator. Alternatively, birth and literary texts simply happens behind closed doors off stage. In the world of Anglophone literature, Lily Gertenbachter comments on the relative dearth of narratives of birth in comparison to the extensive literary portrayal of death. And she's interested in particular in making the comparison between death in war and birth. She's sort of drawing a parallel between in those experiences, the centralization of the body in battle, effectively. She writes, we don't have a familiar canon of nuanced literary or philosophical texts about the experience of having a child, even though having a child too is a profound, frightening, exhilarating, transformative experience at the boundary of life, an experience from which one comes back a different person. So there hasn't been a great deal of literature about birth, but I think slowly this is starting to change, and that feeling is at the heart of this project. Adrienne Rich contends that the majority of women, regardless of their social circumstances or education, have encountered childbirth as a highly charged and highly specific experience. Mysterious, she writes, polluted, often magical, as torture rack or as peak experience. Rarely has it been viewed as one way of knowing and coming to terms with our bodies, of discovering our physical and psychic resources. So what I want to do today is to think about how literary accounts of birth may tease out the relationship between the physical or embodied experience of birth and these questions of knowledge and understanding. So what I'm going to do is to consider in turn 4 pieces of work. These are the French author Camille Laurence's reflective prose Abandonnée, Jessie Greengrass's novel Sight, Maggie Nelson's work of auto theory, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, The Argonauts, and Pamela Aarons's 11 Hours. And I've chosen to read these 4 works together because they each focalize the event of birth as one that is layered with loss, separation, and abandonment. And they each position birth thus as the site of embodied memory and of narrative relationality. So I'm interested in the ways that these works think about birth as a way of knowing oneself and others, but also at the very same time as a site of epistemic and epistemological strain. So I will start with the first of these 4 works, which is Camille Laurence's Abandonnée. It's a short piece of reflective prose within a collection of short stories. The collection was published in 2005 with L'Iconoclaste, edited by Isabelle Lautoral-Larry. And it's a collection of birth stories by some of France's leading authors, including Marie Darrieussecq, Camille Laurence, obviously, Catherine Cusset, Geneviève Brisac. We've heard about some of these authors already in this conference. From the patriarchal mythologization of labor as a kind of unspeakable event around which only cliches may be articulated, to the traumatic unavailability of birth, to the practical impossibility of balancing a pen in hand at the same time as a baby, and to the heteropatriarchal imperative that women are excluded from creative work by virtue of their participation in procreative labor, read as a collection, these stories suggest that there is always a gap of some kind between birth and writing, that the articulation of birth is always somehow, always already alienated. While several stories in the collection linger on the language of birth, experimenting with variety and nuance to consider the plural ways that birth may occur, Laurence's searching prose provides a particularly sustained reflection on the language of birth, and in particular its incommensurability. The title of her work is Abandonnées, which we can translate as The Abandoned Ones. French speakers among you will know that there is a play on words in this title. Abandonnées means the abandoned ones, but you have in the italicized part of the word there the word né, which comes from the verb naître, to be born. So the implication is that there is a certain abandonment at the heart of birth itself, which is the idea that I want to explore. In the text, Laurence revisits the traumatic circumstances of the birth of her son, who died 2 hours after he was born. This is an experience she's written about elsewhere in the autobiographical Philippe. And here she also reflects on the subsequent birth of her daughter. Throughout the piece, Laurence is concerned with the inadequacy of the words, knowledge, and cliches that circulate around birth. I've given the French and English on the slides, but I'll read the English. One says to have a child, but one doesn't have children. One doesn't have a child like one has a cat. One says to see the light of day, but one also sees darkness. Birth for the mother, as for the baby, is to lose someone. It's to be lost. The territory of birth is always exile. For Laurence, it is not just that these phrases are trite, but that in their focalization of the joy of un heureux événement, a happy event, they fail to account for what lies at the heart of birth's incommensurability. Birth is always cut through with loss, absence, and abandonment. So, of course, in her own circumstances, the birth of Philippe is accompanied by silence, senselessness, and the absence of life. Born without sense, no sense at all, born in silence, not seeing the light of day, not seizing time, not given life. But in her description of giving birth for a second time, Laurence talks of being absent herself, or rather of having absented herself. Interpreting her presence as synonymous with Philippe's death, her absence becomes critical in her own mind to her daughter's life, so much so that she feels she must appear dead in order to succeed in giving her daughter life. It is for this reason that Laurence opens the text with the words, "I have given birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl, but I have no experience whatsoever of birth." Birth for Laurence then is always at a remove, and absence lies at its heart. Laurence's opening words are a reminder that birth is also an experience shared between birth giver and baby, never to be claimed by just one person, but touching plural lives. Yet if birth is an event that cannot quite be experienced, let alone expressed, she underscores that irrecuperability and loss belong both to mother and child. Laurence reflects that birth stories are related to us by our mothers, or otherwise, she says, by our neuroses, but they are rarely put into our own words from the perspective of being born. Birth is never simply one's own because its separation derives precisely from an entanglement with the other. And in this, Laurence suggests the sensations of birth always share a close proximity with grief. A sudden coldness, a physical anguish that grips the body, a desire to scream out, an extraordinary vulnerability, the extreme exposure of an unwanted separation. To be born, she writes, is to break a link that one cannot undo. It's a paradoxical abandonment. One is abandoned to someone. One separates from a being that one cannot leave behind. Here, with marked ruptures in her evocation of birth, Laurence gives breathless form to the abandonment engendered in birth's story of two lives, spherically separated and entwined. In a sense, she speculates, all babies are foundlings, children lost then found, born through abandonment. We are born abandoned, she writes. Birth is a place of high risk, a danger submitted to silence, a wildness one tries to frame like a family photo, the past that unchains into the future, the beginning of an end. Place of birth, mortal. If birth or the memory of birth cannot be recorded or framed in this way, she suggests, regarded with an empirical external view, it is because it is tangled up with the grief of separation and abandonment then, and with the unknowability of death. That birth cannot be fully known arguably contributes to its mythologization as some kind of secret or hidden experience for which women and birthing people are not afforded the epistemic tools to navigate. This unknowability gives rise to discourses of birth as a fundamentally primitive act that relegates birth givers to their nature, as I said earlier, in less than empowering ways. Indeed, Laurence observes that the words birth and nature have a close etymological relationship in French. The verb to be born, naître, has the same origin as the word nature, nature. Nativity is natural, birth is a spontaneous act of our mother nature, she writes. But as Laurence's autobiographical writing makes plain, not all births proceed according to the simplistic dogma that binds women and birthing people in an ossifying relationship with the natural. As she continues, the Latin root nativus has also generated the adjective naïf or naive, a notion that suggests a lack of knowledge or ignorance, but one that perhaps also insinuates at the same time a sort of coming to knowledge. Every birth, she writes, should be naive, innocent like the child being born, an innate understanding, a recognition, immediate and without detour, the recognition of the womb. Birth is described here, I think, as a kind of coming to knowledge, innate only in the sense of entangled in sensory embodiment, but also a recognition, a reconnaissance, a recognition of the entangled other. If the word reconnaissance carries undertones perhaps of a kind of survey or military survey of the landscape of the body, specifically the womb, I think Laurence renegotiates this idea in ways that appear to approach birth in provisional form rather than with a kind of specular excavation. Reconnaissance allows the physicality of the birthing body to be recognized rather than recorded, offering forms of knowledge that move from innocence and ignorance, not to empirical regard, but to the relational and the provisional. Playing on the French words naissance, birth, and connaissance, which means knowledge or understanding, Laurence shows that birth is always already caught up in relational webs of entangled knowledge. Birth, naissance, is understanding, connaissance, a co-understanding. There is the mother who brings life into the world. There is the child who comes into the world. They go together, they belong together. Otherwise, birth isn't. And she's playing here again on words. Birth isn't, c'est naître, the verb to be, which is a homophone of naître, which is the verb to be born. In emphasizing entanglement and separation then, Laurence's notion of connaissance allows for ways of recognizing the body and here the womb as the locus of birth, placing knowledge at the heart of birth, while also, I think, staging the possibility of that knowing in question. In the triadic naissance, connaissance and reconnaissance, Laurence attends then to birth as a form of shared, liminal, irrecuperable experience, but also as a way of coming to and perhaps laboring for relational, provisional, and evolving forms of knowing. I'm going to move on to the next text, which is Jessie Greengrass's Sight. Greengrass's debut novel, Sight, was published in 2018 to critical acclaim, and it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. The novel follows the protagonist's internal monologue as she goes through her second pregnancy, and it ends with the birth of this baby. But the narrative itself is very rarely focused on the present time of pregnancy. Instead, it shifts seamlessly back and forth in time as the narrator reflects variously on her earlier and lengthy ruminations and discussions with her partner about whether or not to have children in the first place. We also see her grappling with grief and memories of the death of her mother. We also see her revisit her own and her mother's complex relationships with her psychoanalyst grandmother. In Sight, Greengrass opens a constellation of ideas and images about what we can and cannot see or know about ourselves and others. Traveling through the hidden, inscrutable elements of our fleshy, entangled relations, it's a story of birth and death, which figures Sight, the title, as a coming to knowledge again, the digging in the dark of life's impossible quest. Knowing oneself or others, seeing the ways that we are constituted, regarding our hidden insides, what makes us dead or alive, these are, after all, Greengrass suggests, fundamental concerns of the digging in the dark of philosophical and narrative endeavor. She writes, how simple things would be if only I could know myself or others. If, stepping in between a light source and a screen, I could see the ways that I was constituted, those hidden structures, the bones, the joints that give the rest its shape, and then I might know something for certain, that I was alive or that I would be dead. These two differently slanted articulations of the same fundamental understanding. But instead, there is only this excavation, a digging in the dark, precarious, uncertain, impossible to complete. Greengrass's prose is interspersed with historical accounts of figures in science, medicine, psychoanalysis, and art, who are all in some way engaged in this idea of digging in the dark. They're all somehow engaged in the precarious projection of an inside that can never be fully known. So there is, for example, Wilhelm Röntgen, who discovers the first X-ray and produces an image of his wife's hand, rendering the hidden manifest. Another figure is Sigmund Freud, whose work on the development of psychoanalysis, the hidden unconscious, but also his relationship with his daughter Anna is discussed. And there is also John Hunter's work on surgery, his collaborations with his brother William and with the artist Jan van Riemsdyk on the anatomy of pregnant women's bodies. So drawing these figures into the narrative, Greengrass considers X-rays, excavations of the mind, casts and imprints, and mobilizes in the text a kind of a clasping of the body in literal and metaphorical terms of imaging. Though there is always something about the flesh, about the other, that remains out of sight. As she writes, our lives are possibility reduced to rough particularity by contact, touch, and out of it the specificity of each of us comes, so that to ask if we might have been better otherwise is to wish ourselves undone. Sense of being undone. It's quite Butlerian vocabulary, the opening up to the other, what makes us vulnerable through love and loss. The sense of being undone reverberates through sight, and it's underscored throughout by the close proximity of birth and death. So we see again, sort of the interweaving of birth and death, both posturing a metaphysical boundary of life. Both, as Lily Gerten-Wachter reminded us earlier, featuring a body in battle at borderlines. As the narrator progresses through her pregnancy and meditates on motherhood, she finds that her embodied experiences of entwinement and separation are layered with memories of loss, of being undone in death, and in grieving for her mother. Her mother fell ill soon after the narrator's 21st birthday, succumbing to lengthy illness after an initial collapse. Her need for her daughter's care slowing temporarily or forcing into reverse, as Greengrass writes, that inevitable process of separation, which was adolescence. Greengrass writes beautifully of the paradoxical slowness and suddenness of death, of how her death had seemed like a sudden event slowed down, a single shocking moment that went on for months, of the immutability of loss and of a grief which was earned, awful but particular, a possession whose ownership could not be rescinded. After her mother's death, the narrator is referred by her GP for an MRI, having experienced debilitating headaches. And she's conscious of being able to look inwards. The narrator approaches the MRI as a kind of ritual of passage. She describes it as a proof at last of all that constituted me. It is not, however, as she imagines, and this imaging of her brain provides her with no information, offers no representation of her loss. Instead, and over time and with familiarity, the memory of her mother's death becomes less of a wound and instead something of a pattern, something woven into me, a part of that composite I had become, which was a fraction of what I might have been. So in this novel, the event of birth merges with memories of death in ways that epitomizes the enfleshment of a conundrum of knowing and not knowing, seeing and not seeing oneself and others, of the embodiment of separation and loss. After agonizing over whether to have children and finding out that she is pregnant after months of disappointment, the narrator finds her first pregnancy a bewildering and lonely experience, in spite, or perhaps because of the new knowledge that she is in fact no longer alone. She writes, "I tried to remember that I was not alone, without yet understanding the full import of it, that aloneness was now in the past and that I might come to long for it, the stillness of a body unkicked from inside or out." The birth itself is described as a 10-hour lesson in topography, during which she heard herself call out but couldn't understand the words. She writes, "I felt I had not quite done things properly and that my own experience lacked in some way that element necessary to transform it into knowledge, that it remained not the thing itself but only a picture of it, so that I was not quite yet a mother." Her final description of the birth of her second child at 37 weeks at the end of the novel also features this tussle with knowing and not knowing, as Greengrass crafts a montage of fragments of sensations and memories of labour, a bag packed ready in the hallway, a bus ride to the hospital, walking around the car park to stimulate labour, being induced, the feeling that my body was turning itself inside out. I remember it only in snatches. And then there is a fascinating moment of revelation, of sight, as it were, of perfect clarity, of the inside finally being known, regarded, before that moment passes, unfolds into new beginnings of a new relationship where that bodily knowledge, again, immediately slips away. It's quite a long quotation, but I will read it out. "Then this, the moment all else falls away from. The pain stops and someone hands my daughter to me, her tiny body heating at the air. And for an instant we are nothing but a single surface, joined, laid out beneath the light, and everything is perfect, clear. I know her absolutely and all her history is mine, for I have seen it all. Then time, then growth obscures. The cord is cut, our separation starts. She is taken from me, weighed, dressed. I close my eyes in relief that it is over and the first part of her life is lost to me. Johannes holds her partner. She starts to cry, a newborn's wail of bleak surprise, and we do not know the reason, but must try somehow to find it out." So as for Laurence, here Greengrass positions birth as a site of knowledge, but also of a certain epistemic strain, the strain of separation, loss, abandonment at the heart of the enfleshment of birth and growth. While for Laurence, connaissance offers the possibility of shared knowledge, shared understanding, even in the event of birth as a form of abandonment, Greengrass underscores further that recognition of self and other in birth is always provisional and momentary, an abandonment that confers exclusion from knowledge at the very moment of understanding. That extra thing that knowledge, understanding is, not the mere serendipity of discovery, but the moment of its tipping into insight, which draws our lonely curiosity. We are unsatisfied. Revelation is by definition isolate. It can neither be communicated nor transferred. And trying to comprehend it, we feel only the chill of our exclusion. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our third text now, which is Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts. As I said earlier, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this text already. Nelson's The Argonauts is, it's a beautiful, powerful reflection on birth, death, sex, at the heart of which, again, lies an epistemic conundrum. And for Nelson, this is whether words can ever be enough, whether everything can be thought. Nelson's writing is steeped in philosophical musings from Wittgenstein to Barthes to Deleuze to Butler, Irigaray, Preciado, interlaced with lyrical passages evoking episodes of love, loss, birth, death, sex, sodomitical motherhood, and queer parenting. At the beginning of the text, the narrator describes the beginnings of her love affair with her transitioning partner, Harry, in which bodily pleasures mingle with intellectual play. Maggie alludes to having spent a lifetime devoted to Wittgenstein's idea, excuse me, that the inexpressible is contained inexpressibly in the expressed. And she says, its paradox is quite literally why I write, or how I feel able to keep writing. Harry, on the other hand, rejects the idea that words can ever be good enough and argues that once something is named, we can never see it in the same way again. The following passage responds to this conundrum that runs through Nelson's writing and that gives the text its title, The Argonauts. Nelson writes, a day or two after my love pronouncement, now feral with vulnerability, I sent you a passage from Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes, in which Barthes describes how the subject, who utters the phrase, I love you, is like the Argonaut renewing his ship during its voyage without changing its name. Just as the Argo's parts may be replaced over time, that the boat is still called the Argo, whenever the love utters the phrase, I love you, its meaning must be renewed by each use, as the very task of love and of language is to give one and the same phrase inflections which will be forever new. So how to be engaged in that task of renewal in love and in language at the same time, I think is dramatized by Nelson's writing, as she rails against the ingrained dialectic between thinking and embodying that is raised by pregnancy and maternity, and that I've been talking about. Nelson is an intellectual and an academic as well as a writer, and has plenty of anecdotes about the seeming incompatibility of motherhood and intellectual life. I cannot hold my baby at the same time as I write is a kind of motif that runs through the work, but that the very writing of the text, which is of course a story of birth and a highly intellectualized work of auto-theory, nonetheless strains against. Nelson recalls a patronizing Renaissance scholar, an academic male, who tries to assure her by way of anecdote that her interest in intellectual pursuits will probably come back after the first 2 years of her baby's life. This is while she's at an academic conference. In another episode, while at a Q&A where she's giving a talk about a book on cruelty, a man asks a question about how she was able to handle the darkness of the material while she was pregnant. Nelson writes, leave it to the old patrician white guy to call the lady speaker back to her body, so that no one misses the spectacle of that wild oxymoron, the pregnant woman who thinks, which is really just a pumped up version of that more general oxymoron, a woman who thinks. So if it is the task of love and language to give to one and the same phrase meanings that will ever be new, Nelson's writing brings that task to bear on the meaning of birth, as she brings feeling together at the same time as thinking and knowing. Nelson describes birth as falling forever, falling to pieces, which is the title of my talk. And she, in this phrase, I think she evokes an embodied and cognitive shattering. To let the baby out, you have to be willing to go to pieces, she writes. But going to pieces in Nelson's writing is far from a relinquishing to the outside, a loss of self to the mastery of the medical other, nor is it a submission to nature in the absence of thought. Like Greengrass, like Laurence, Nelson inscribes the physicality of birth, blood and bile, layered with reflection on the proximity of birth and death. As she writes, if all goes well, the baby will make it out alive, and so will you. Nonetheless, you will have touched death along the way. You will have realized that death will do you too, without fail and without mercy. It will do you, even if you don't believe it will do you, and it will do you in its own way. There's never been a human that didn't. While for Greengrass's narrator, pregnancy and birth are layered with her own embodied memories of past experiences of loss, abandonment, and separation, Maggie's reflections on birth works through simultaneously her partner Harry's grief about his mother's recent death. Writing birth thus becomes a kind of an act of love and an act of narrative relationality, an act of rethinking and renewal in articulating new meanings for birth, but also an attribute of her love for Harry, a recognition as well of the respective embodied transformations that they have experienced alongside birth and death. Where Laurence renews the meaning of birth in her elaboration of birth as connaissance, Nelson draws striking attention to another word often used in birth scenarios, and this is the word reckoning. She writes, at the bottom, which one can't quite know is the bottom, one reckons. I've heard a lot of women describe this reckoning, it might also be called 9 centimeters, which one starts bargaining hard as if striking a deal to save your conjoined lives. I don't know how we're going to get out of this, baby, but word is you've got to come out and that I've got to let you, and we've got to do it together and we've got to do it now. Reckoning is often described in birth manuals as being the kind of point of no return, as it were, the mother's stark realization that there is nothing that can be done to stop the birth from occurring. It tends to be positioned as a moment of necessary submission to the body. To reckon is to bargain, and as Maggie bargains with Iggy, her child, birth is imagined as something in which they are both actively physically engaged. But to reckon is, of course, also to think. In Nelson's writing of birth, which calls attention to the structuring dialectics that have disallowed birthing women and people from experiencing and feeling at the same time as, alongside, through, and within thinking and knowing, reckoning perhaps offers another way to think about birth that places thinking at the center. Significantly, it privileges forms of thinking from within and without the mother-child relationship, forms of embodied experiencing, feeling, thinking. Like the Argonaut, then, Nelson makes space in the narrative of birth for the moment of reckoning, renewing its meaning without, in fact, changing its name, giving it an acts of love and language, inflections that are ever new. Okay, so I'm going to come to my final work now, which is Pamela Ahrens's 11 Hours. While the 3 works that I've discussed thus far all focus on the embodied experience of birth, I think nowhere is the absolute physicality of the event of labour rendered with more detail and with more poetry than in Pamela Ahrens's 2016 novel, 11 Hours. 11 Hours follows the story of 31-year-old Law as she enters a New York hospital alone to labour for the birth of her first child. The father of her baby is not present, nor does Law have any friends or family with her to support her during the birth, but she seems not to be overly concerned by this, and she demonstrates a sort of a quiet resolve. Law has done plenty of preparation and thinking about the birth, and like many in her position, she comes to the hospital equipped with a very detailed birth plan, several pages long. And the birth itself doesn't, of course, proceed according to that envisaged plan. These include decisions that testify to her desire not to have an overly medicalized birth. For example, her wish not to wear a fetal monitoring belt, which is swiftly disregarded due to hospital protocol. And perhaps more unusually, her wishes for what should happen should either she or the baby not survive. So it is as evident to the reader as it is to Franklin, who is Law's attending midwife, that Law has done her best to enter into this physical event equipped with knowledge, well-informed, cognitively prepared. We learn that detail did not bore her, detail was power. Law is clear in her own mind about her choices, her desire for agency, and she's resistant to putting herself entirely in the hands of strangers, in the hands of others whose interests, that should be whose interests, might not coincide with her own. As Law's labour progresses, however, all forms of knowledge, medical, personal, embodied, are put to the test. She is told to try to wait until 6 or 7 centimeters before going into the hospital. She's told this by her childbirth instructor during antenatal classes. But who knew when that would be, Laure wonders. You'll have a pretty good idea, the instructor tells her. So Laure staves off at the beginning stages of labour. She's at home alone in her bathroom before taking a taxi to the hospital at the point at which her pains are fierce enough to have her on all fours, pulling hard against the pipes in her bathroom in desperation, only to be told on arrival at the hospital that she is in fact only 3 centimetres dilated. So the medical knowledge she has acquired, though necessary on some level, is insistently shown to be arbitrary. As Franklin reveals, you can spend 6 hours getting to 3 centimetres and go from there to 10 in 45 minutes. It doesn't really mean that much. Laure asks, why do they check then? And Franklin replies, because we all like to measure things. Franklin vows early on to help the silent and inscrutable Laure to open up physically and emotionally, attending to her body, instructing Laure to get down on all fours during contractions, to open her mouth wide and to yell from the very back of her throat, such that Laure begins to realize how pointless it is to fight her body and the pain it sends, stretching and widening one to make new life, demanding that the self fall back and make space. As the novel progresses and Laure enters into advanced labour, it is suddenly discovered as the baby descends that Laure has suffered a placental abruption. This is when the placenta comes away from the womb, and it's caused a large pool of trapped blood to be suddenly released, and her uterus to be clenched in a great and pauseless contraction. And this places Laure and the baby's life in grave danger. The narrative, which has until this point shifted between Laure and Franklin's perspectives, briefly in this moment takes on a rather more clinical tone, providing a kind of a retrospective explanation for the abruption. But it's interesting to note that the narrative here necessarily falters, as no complete medical explanation is in fact possible. And we become aware instead of the full force of the birthing body's escape from knowledge, both medical and personal. No reason, no blame can be located. Who can be blamed for this? The mother felt no symptoms. The labour nurse checked her and the baby's vitals frequently. Dr. Elspeth Chang ordered the routine number of ultrasounds, and ultrasounds do not always detect even advanced abruptions. Dr. Merchant followed the protocol of breaking the membranes of a woman whose advanced labour is progressing erratically. What if there is no one at all to blame? In other words, what if, as Greengrass suggests, we can never really know what is happening inside? As in Laurence, Greengrass, and Nelson, Ahrens's description of Laure's embodied experience of the opening involved in labour contractions also gives rise to memories, reflections, and flashbacks that see her grapple with previous instances of separation and loss. Laure is grieving the loss of 2 key figures in her life. She has become estranged from her former partner, Asa, after finding out that he has been having an affair with her best friend, who is also his childhood friend and former lover, Julia. Julia is the person who had initially introduced them. Like Greengrass's narrator, Laure too has mourned the loss of a mother while herself on the cusp of adulthood after caring for her mother during a prolonged illness. As Laure's uterus pulses with contractions then, her body ripples with the embodied memory of abandonment and separation. Her mother's illness contracted around her and squeezed her into a different shape. Throughout the novel, as Laure submits to every contraction, memories of Julia and Asa intrude upon the narrative. The physicality of Laure's body opening up then is set in sharp relief against her feelings of loss, loneliness, and abandonment. And in the end, all her preparation and knowledge does not keep her safe. But Ahrens nonetheless gestures in the novel to what we might think of as a kind of connaissance in Laurence's sense of the word, a shared understanding of birth, one that positions birth at the very site of abandonment and of the embodied memory of loss. Laure may be the protagonist of the novel, but as I mentioned earlier, the narrative perspective flickers back and forth between her and Franklin. as Franklin attends to Law's labouring body and carries within herself her own set of birth stories about birth, but also about loss. Franklin has years of experience as a midwife within the American medical setting that she now works in, and she is described as always having been drawn to birth giving, assisting from births from a very young age in her native Haiti, where she learned to turn a breech baby and to apply herbal compresses, where the villagers referred to her as a pont, a bridge that could bring life safely from womb to world. Franklin is also several weeks pregnant herself, although this is not yet apparent to the wider world, and she is cautious, having lost a baby as a young woman in Haiti just 3 days after its birth, and having experienced more recently a miscarriage at 22 weeks. After this miscarriage, it was discovered that she has a bicornuate or heart-shaped uterus that may have impeded fetal growth. So Franklin carries her own stories of birth and loss. And moving between Franklin and Law's pregnant bodies and embodied memories, Herrens gives breath to the hidden stories of pain that spill from their flesh, just like the hidden stories that Law glimpses in the eyes of an older woman in a hospital corridor who watches her in labour. These moments of recognition and solidarity are never really voiced. They're never shared directly between Law and Franklin, but they are nonetheless communicated in a kind of shared understanding in the narrative fabric, in a connaissance of birth, in Franklin's attentiveness to Law's body, in their silent complicity, and perhaps even in Franklin's acknowledgement from the start that Law's story is not one that she can ever fully know. A story I will never fully hear, Franklin thinks, even if she offers bits of it to me. We only have a matter of hours, and it's the body that concerns us here today, what it needs, what it has no choice but to do. A story may not ever fully be heard, and what happens to Law in birth may never be explained. But while Herrens' novel again highlights the tense relationship between the body and knowledge in birth, underscoring gaps in knowledge in its weaving of Law and Franklin's birth stories, there is a sense of shared understanding and of narrative relationality. In the end, as Law's body falters, it is Franklin, attentive midwife and fully present herself to the abandonment and loss engendered in birth, who carries the narrative for Law, and whose words will infiltrate Law's semi-conscious state. It is Franklin who delivers to Law not only her child, but also the narrative, if not the exact medical knowledge of the birth. So I'm going to draw things to a close at this point. What I've hoped to do today is to offer through these 4 works some ways of thinking about birth that move beyond the polarized medical versus natural models of birth giving that tend to circulate in popular discourse, and that, I've argued, disallow birthing women and people from approaching birth as both embodied and thinking beings. Each of these authors, I think, navigates a new relationship between birth and knowledge, dismantling the dichotomy of creation and procreation, offering ways to rethink what we can know about birth as well as birth's incommensurability. These authors draw into relief popular cliches surrounding birth, including those of the unspeakable and the unspoken. They negotiate medical discourses of birth, but they also offer relational and provisional narratives that attend to birth as both an embodied and epistemic event. Approaching birth in this way demands a sensitivity to embodied entanglement, to falling forever, falling to pieces, and thus to forms of coming to knowledge that may always slip away from an external regard. At the edge of experience, these birth stories are palimpsestic. They reveal layers of embodied memories of pain, loss, separation, and love, offering up bodies and stories that are entangled and enmeshed in the bodies and stories of others. Crucially, I think they also reveal the importance of a kind of feminist labor of thinking about birth and thinking birth as offering an unparalleled philosophical, political, and narrative opportunity to reflect upon the epistemic conundrum that is epitomized by Greengrass, of, as she writes, stepping between a light source and a screen in the impossible attempt of knowing oneself and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amaleena, for just such a scintillating, rich, nuanced, powerful, and amazing paper this morning. I haven't made this many notes in a long time, and I've just found it so thought-provoking. I'm just going to open the floor straight away to anyone that would like to pose a question. You can raise your hand, you can put it straight in the chat. It's entirely up to you, but I'm sure that we're going to have plenty of questions to kind of bring to this discussion. I mean, maybe whilst we're waiting for, I was going to say maybe whilst we're waiting, but I might go straight to Blaise. So I'm going to just ask to unmute, hopefully.
Yes, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Amaleena, for your talk. I have a question that's, I guess, a little bit more related to the kind of general secondary literature and discussion that you encountered in terms of French and Francophone studies. Because I'm wondering if, I know at the beginning you mentioned, it can be challenging to kind of find nuanced studies of birth. And I was just wondering if in your research and in your general kind of knowledge of French women's and feminist issues, if you found that kind of debates about essentialism within French feminism, which are, pretty virulent, historic and current debates, if in some ways that might kind of make it more difficult to have nuanced discussions about that, because there have been so many debates about, can we talk about a kind of feminism rooted in a woman's body and maternity? I'm thinking of like Hélène Cixous, Catherine Clément, like those kinds of classics. So anyway, that might be something that really was not pertinent to your research and didn't come up, but I was just wondering if you had any comment on that, or if you found any kind of intertextuality at all in any of the texts you came across.
Thank you so much, Blaise, for your question. That's really interesting and helpful as well. I mean, I sort of, when I first started thinking about this, and people were saying to me, oh, what about Cixous? What about Kristeva? They all talk about birth. And what I was really struck by was, I mean, you're absolutely right that, within the context of French feminism, there are a set of thorny questions around, essentialism that can be difficult to grapple with. And my feeling is that Cixous, Kristeva, Irigaray do offer ways of thinking about femininity, women, that allow us to move beyond those essentialized positions. But it's not my sense that they do that in any meaningful way when it comes to the question of birth itself. And what I found quite striking is that birth, in quite a lot of French feminist philosophy, but also just French philosophy and philosophy more generally, birth itself, again, it is never really approached in any kind of significant or developed way as an embodied experience. So when people talk about birth, when we see it in Cixous, in Kristeva, it's often a kind of a way to think about psychical relationships, rather than about the experience of the body itself, beyond the context of sort of French feminism and philosophy more broadly. It's often a way to think about, I mean, we think of sort of Irigaray, but also Hannah Arendt, Cavalero. When they talk about birth, it's often from the perspective of natality rather than birth giving. So I found it helpful to not to disregard those instances of thinking about, birth in French feminism, but I wasn't finding anything helpful there that was allowing me to think about the physicality of the event of birth in ways that were moving on from this idea of fixed notions of nature. So I sort of, I left it to one side, is the answer really. And I haven't found anything subsequently within French feminism that has been useful to me at to this point.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Katie, which I'll just read out. Thank you very much for this powerful and illuminating talk, Amaleena. You briefly mentioned the ways in which neoliberal logics intersect with these discourses about birth and labour. And I wondered if you could say more about that, and if you found that these authors resist those logics in their writing. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and I think I was talking there about Alison Phipps's work and this idea of presenting the kind of possibility for positive, empowering discourses around birth giving as very much bound up with agency and choice, but then sort of disregarding the kind of the structural inequalities that actually will lead certain women, certain birthing women or birthing people to experience birth in very different ways. And I think, a lot of that is marketed and commodified very, very, very unusefully and presented in this very sort of illusory sense of empowerment that many people just sort of buy into. I mean, it's an interesting question whether these authors resist those logics in their writing. I mean, I think the answer to that question probably comes in this idea of narrative, which is, I mean, my field is ultimately one of literature, and I think in storytelling and in providing narratives that allow us to think about birth in ways that exceed that kind of model of those models of nature and empowerment through the natural and submission to the body. I think storytelling can be a really powerful way of resisting that kind of quite constrained, otherwise constrained discourse that disallows any kind of like plural ways of thinking about it. And that's why one of the things I've been really interested in is this idea of sort of relationality, of sharing birth stories, but also, in the last text that I was discussing, but also in the Argonauts as well, thinking about how birth stories are entwined in the stories in other people's stories and other people's birth stories, but also in other people's stories of separation and loss and all of the things that are psychically and in psychic and embodied terms wrapped up in that experience. So I'd say that narrative storytelling plays a really important role in that resistance.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Amaleena. Okay, we have another question through the chat. This is from Sabine Sharp. First, thanks so much for your engaging and insightful paper. Here. You talked about narratives of taking back control in some birthing manuals, which of course reminded me of Brexit. I wondered if you could elaborate on the ways in which these birthing manuals might centre a white Western subject who takes back control of her borders. I'm also thinking of the fantasized rebirth of the British Empire longed for by some Brexiteers. I mean, very interesting question, Amaleena.
Wow, that's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's so interesting. You say, of course, reminded you of Brexit. It wasn't as an immediate connection for me, but I think that's absolutely fascinating, taking back control. I mean, yes, completely. Birthing manuals, do they center a white Western subject? Absolutely. I mean, you only have to look at the covers of some of the manuals that I put up on the slides there to see how much the discourse is dominated by thinking about what appeals to and what is relevant to the white Western subject. And there have been so many reports in the media recently about the experiences of Black and Asian women and people in birth, and the sort of the statistics around negative outcomes in birth for people of color in this country, but I'm sure across the West is absolutely appalling. And I was reading a report recently that was looking at some statistics in this regard, but also there were some interviews with midwives, or midwives had given some comments on their training and how they had been told things like, Asian women can't withstand pain as much as other races. For example, that Scandinavian people of Scandinavian origin are more likely to be able to have the kinds of bodies that can withstand pain, that Black women and people, because of their anatomy, are likely to have longer labors. And you think about the circulation of these awful stereotypes, and again, it comes back to the body and the nature of the body, and these sort of ideas that the way one's body is designed, biologically designed, is that it's appropriate to talk then about how that person's experience of birth will be. So I think there is a huge lack of knowledge around people of colour and their experiences of birth in the West. And absolutely all of the discourse and knowledge that is present within the medical context, and really actually within the cultural context as well, disregards people of colour in the sense which is a huge problem. And all of the stories that I've been talking about today actually are also focused on white experiences of birth, with the exception of the character of Franklin, and that's an element of my project that I'm really interested in, as well as I've said that this is a project that's really in the initial stages, and I'm still looking for material on this area. We were also thinking about the fantasized rebirth of the British Empire longed for by some Brexiteers. I mean, I think there are all sorts of problematic metaphors, bodily metaphors, that are deployed in political discourse, in colonial and neo-colonial discourse around the female body, around the birthing body, that are mobilized in this way to, again, it's a kind of that are mobilized in this way to reinforce a power dynamic at the heart of which certain kinds of bodies are always going to be used as collateral.
Oh, okay. Another question just popped in from Ellie Walters. Thank you so much, Amaleena, for your truly wonderful paper. I'm so interested in this idea of birth as an embodied and cognitive shattering. That was going to be my question, Ellie. As a kind of loss or source of grief. So many potential birth givers spend their lives speculating, imagining, worrying about, even dreading birth, being shattered or undone by the very idea of what is considered an unavoidable destiny allocated to them by the essentialism you touched upon. I was just wondering if you've encountered this kind of birth story in your research, stories built out of lifelong unknowing, out of trepidation for what is supposedly to come. That's beautifully put as well. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks, Ellie. That's a beautifully phrased question, and you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's quite that's quite difficult to navigate or to negotiate is that, you know, I mean, I have been talking about the issues that I have with many of these birth manuals, to give some perspective and to make some positive comments about some of them. I think what a lot of birth manuals, especially the kind of the hypnobirthing and natal hypnotherapy sort of strand of things, I think a lot of what they do very well these days is to address precisely this, you know, that a lot of people who are considering birth or who find themselves pregnant have a lot of trepidation, speculation, dread, as you say, around the experience and what it will mean for them in terms of that embodied and cognitive shattering. And I think some of that is about birth being very generally something about which people don't really talk very much, you know, or if they do, they talk about it in hushed tones, or if they do talk about it, you know, often if people are talking about birth, it's because of a difficult experience, so that contributes to the anxiety. And I think what a lot of contemporary birth manuals do very well is to work through, often in a quite sort of cognitive CBT sort of influenced way, the kinds of anxieties that people may carry on an individual but also a cultural collective level, such that they can then arrive at a point, hopefully, in which those anxieties, trepidations, that dread isn't as present. And I think a lot of that is very useful. However, I will come back to this issue that I have with the way that it's often laid out, which is that what seems inevitably to happen is that to let go of those anxieties, it's about sort of, you know, turning off your mind. It's about embracing the fact that you have to be just body. And that's, you know, that is where the limitations, I think, of that kind of discourse come through. In the birth stories that I've been reading, I mean, absolutely, there's a lot of, I mean, in Jessie Greengrass, for example, I mean, she's pregnant at the time of writing. She's already had one child, but she thinks back to the beginnings of her relationship with her current partner, and she spends a long time thinking about, you know, does she want to have a child or not with this person at all? Is this something that she can envisage? And part of that speculation is about, you know, does she want to go through this cognitive and embodied shattering? So there's a real sense of you know, and this is all in flashback, but there's a real sense of, in her present position of pregnancy, of that being carried with her, and also in her present reality as a mother of one and soon to be two, that part of her is still there. That, you know, that those questions around, do I want to be a mother or not? Okay, I've made that decision. Now I'm just a mother. Well, no, actually, she's, you know, that part of her that was always wondering that, and that ambivalence is still present. And I'm thinking now, of course, of Sheila Hetty's book Motherhood, about which Jasmine recommended the book to me, I think, and has talked about it so eloquently. Which again is I think it's Motherhood, a novel. Is that correct, Jasmine? But it is, you know, it is. Like Maggie Nelson's book, it's a work of kind of it brings in theory, and it's autobiographical in many, and it is a rumination on whether or not to have a child, whether or not to have to become a mother. And Sheila Hetty I think in the end decides not to have a child, but she has this lovely section in it where she's talking about how we are all not mothers, and I forget the exact phrasing, but it's so beautifully wrought in a way that, you know, even if one is a mother or not, we're all not mothers. And there's that sense in which the kind of the double negative creates a sort of a commonality to being somebody who has considered motherhood as an option, and for whom, even if one is not a mother, motherhood is nonetheless part of a kind of a cultural discourse and mode of being that impacts upon us all. So that's, you know, that's a fascinating work as well. I hope that's that was a very roundabout answer. I hope this sort of answers your question.
I love that quote so much, and I've put it in the chat because it's like such an important quote, and thank you so much for such a fascinating response to that. If there's anyone else that would like to put in a question, we still have just under 10 minutes, and maybe I'll take this opportunity to slip in there. Just two questions really. One maybe linking to the other project that you mentioned. Do you come across a lot of accounts of birth as all consuming, this idea of the body being consumed, or as I think about Rachel Cusk, who talks a lot about, you know, this sense of becoming a mother is essentially this all-consuming. She loses something of herself, which kind of maybe links to a lot of the themes that you were talking about, but it's not strictly about birth. I was thinking about this idea of being consumed, and then, of course, whether you'd managed to come across any narratives of those with eating disorders and pregnancy and birth, which are often extremely challenging experiences. I mean, like so many other kind of you know, marginal groups or, you know, non-normative pregnancies, these narratives are very rare, but I was just wondering, it was making me think about that as well. And then the other question, which is completely different, is we at the post-feminist kind of seminar colloquium a couple of months ago, question came up about questions of the representations of birth in the kind of, you know, mainstream media, but in film and in culture, and to what extent that contributes in some way to this kind of unhelpful dichotomy between the hyper-medicalized, kind of like, I would say almost like sanitized version of what birth is, versus the kind of maybe this kind of like the more natural earth mama sort of idea, and wondering what the mainstream and how that impacts our understanding of birth, and then in some way dictates or preordains how a woman should be in those spaces, because it is always a woman generally in the mainstream media who is giving birth, rather than a birthing body or a person who's giving birth. So two slightly different prongs of question there, but yeah.
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, that's really brilliant. Birth is all consuming. I mean, I think there is so much literature on motherhood, and especially early motherhood, as all consuming. And some of that touches upon, you know, some of that is about the sort of the enormity and the trauma of birth itself, but then moving very quickly into the early stages of motherhood, and a baby that, you know, is latched on at all times, that isn't sleeping. And I think a lot of that idea of, you know, the all-consuming nature of motherhood pertains to those. And you mentioned Rachel Cusk. Also thinking about Holly McNeish's poetry in Nobody Told Me, which is you know, I've talked about elsewhere. And so I think it's more about those early stages than about birth itself, the experience of labour itself. I mean, one thing comes to mind, which is, you know, you related it to my other project, and so the thing that comes to mind is one of Ananda Devi's most recent novels, which is called Manger l'autre. And it's a story about a young woman who is overweight, and she's described as having been born at at a very large birth weight, and there's this sort of narrative around the fact that her father tells her that she had a twin that she consumed in utero, and her mother abandons her and has this. There's a very brief description of the birth, but that is one in which the mother is almost kind of like swallowed up by this baby that comes into the world, and the mother's existence is just sort of diminished by this child. And I mean, there's something a bit uncomfortable about the way the metaphor of the obese child is being used there, I think. But that's an example that immediately came to mind. I haven't actually come across, and I would love some recommendations if anyone has any. I haven't really come across any literary works that deal with, in any extensive way, with eating disorders within pregnancy. I mean, I can think of stories where the protagonist has recovered from an eating disorder and then gone on to have a child, and often that's a kind of a way of showing, a way of sort of proving or showing, demonstrating the kind of the process of recovery, that this person has then gone on to have a child, the reproductive system is now functioning. But I haven't actually come across any that have dealt in any expansive way with eating disorders within pregnancy and within birth. And I would be fascinated if anyone has any recommendations, and please do let me know. Your second question was about birth in the mainstream, wasn't it?
Kind of post-feminist kind of way in which we depict birth, or
yeah. I mean, the way birth is represented in there was a great paper on this yesterday, actually, in one of the panels, but the way the birth is commonly represented on TV and in film tends to follow the same pattern of, there is this visual moment of waters breaking. And I think it creates this utterly false narrative that's the first thing that happens in labor, that your waters break. And then, one comes to learn that actually happens much, much later. But I mean, I think it's a very visual metaphor. It's very difficult, I think, to show on screen, the often very slow way in which labor begins with, contractions that then build. And, obviously every birth is different. So, one person's experience of that is going to be completely different, but it is not, generally speaking, it is not thought of to be that common that the waters breaking is the first thing. But I think that creates an absolutely entrenched narrative in people's minds of how birth is. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I think there's also, if you look at mainstream film and television depictions of birth, also they all tend to be in hospitals as well. They all tend to have the woman, as you say, it does tend to be the woman on a hospital bed. Whereas, when you start to think about birth and preparing for birth, the dynamic model of moving around, home birth, these things are very rarely captured. And if birth happens not in a hospital, it's because someone hasn't been rushed, hasn't got there in time, and it's in a car or the side of the road or something like that. So yeah, there are a lot of sort of cliches, I think, that are repeated, and those are the cliches that are repeated. But there isn't a kind of plurality to the way that birth is depicted in the mainstream.
Thank you so much. We've got a final question. I think it will be the final one, and we are at 11 o'clock, so it might have to be a slightly briefer response, I'm afraid, although I think we could all chat here for days. So I'll quickly read through it. Thanks so much, Amaleena. That was so incredibly rich and fascinating. I was interested in what you were saying about this problematic idea of shutting down the neocortex in the handbooks. I was wondering, against and beyond this, what do you think needs to be explored about the specifically neural or neuroplastic experience of birth? And how would this fit in with the contemporary feminist philosophies of the brain or of neuroplasticity, like in Catherine Malabou? And also, is there any possible feminist reclaiming or emancipatory way to reconfigure this neural shutting down? Could neuroplasticity be used somehow for a different kind of shutting down, self-emancipation, transformation? So a really simple question to end on there for you. Thank you. And that's from Ben Dalton. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. I had a feeling you might ask something like this. Thank you. It's not something that I've given a great deal of thought to just yet, which you might find surprising given my interest in Malibu. But yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a fascinating avenue to explore. And I think neuroplasticity completely offers potential for rethinking the ways that the mind and body, brain and womb, as it were, are just so radically polarized and separated in medical, popular, in even philosophical literary discourse around birth. So yeah, I mean, I can't really say much more than that for now, but it's a brilliant comment, and it's been sort of at the back of my mind to pursue. So thanks for raising it.
And on that note, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you to Ben and Becky for putting on this wonderful event. But most of all, I'd like to extend our thanks to Amaleena for, again, such a scintillating and just such a thought-provoking and refreshing approach to these questions. And I hope that all of you will stay around and enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the program. We've got so many good papers today, so I would strongly encourage you to stick around. And thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Jasmine, as well, for your wonderful sharing.